Hello everyone, this is Ronaldo Villanueva. I hope that everyone who is listening to this is having a fantastic day. Today I'm joined by a new guest, the American critic and writer Tevis Thompson, who probably a lot of people listening to this podcast may already know. Uh, say hi Tevis.
Hello.
So Tevis has written a lot of pieces about video games, so his range of knowledge covers different media, and his writing is characterized by the capability of externalizing personal experiences. He describes in his website tevisthompson.com what things are like instead of what they actually are. He's also the co-author of the graphic novel Second Quest. So today we're going to talk about a Japanese TV show called Shoujo Kakumei Utena, known in the West as Revolutionary Girl Utena, made by the creative group B Papas at the helm of director Kunihiko Ikuhara in 1997. It is a show about an orphan teenager named Utena, whose childhood desire is to become a prince through adopting masculine traits, and is drawn to a series of sword duels to win and keep a mysterious girl called Ensi, who is also known as the Rose Bride and possesses the power to revolutionize the world. The show became hugely influential, setting a new standard on series oriented at female and queer audiences that led to different creators, both in Japan and in the West, to be inspired by it, to make numerous works that are currently banners of feminist and LGBT representation in different media, particularly animation. Revolutionary, Revolutionary Girl Utena had its 25th anniversary this year in April, and in commemoration of its legacy, we're assembled here to talk about the show's merits, the significance that this show had in our lives, and we'll attempt to draw a conclusion about its current relevance after more than 2 decades after its broadcast. So, as our starting point, I think it is important that each of us talks about our first contact with the show since we came across this story at different points in our lives, and it helps to illustrate our respective points. So I'd like to start with you, Tevis. How did you get to know this show? What caught your attention, and how was your first experience with this work?
Um, okay. So I am, in a broader context, a relative newbie to anime.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the late 90s when I could have seen Utena but didn't, was crazy about Evangelion. And I was in college at the time and really got into that, but not much more. It was kind of like a one-off for me. I suspect that back in those times, it was a lot harder to find anime. And when you're getting into like a new, a whole new world, like anime world,
Mm-hmm.
you don't know where to start. I didn't have money to like buy VHS tapes. I wasn't really connected online in a way to like download stuff outside of like Napster. So I just outside of Evangelion and a few other things, Serial Experiments Lane, and I think I watched some of Escaflowne, a few things, but I basically didn't see much anime. And then 20 years passed, and I've always been very interested in television. And the last few years, I got kind of restless with what I was watching. I'd seen the Twin Peaks return, and was really excited by it, but it also made other television seem really dull. And so I started looking around more. After the pandemic started, I happened to, well, the year before that, I had watched the Dark Crystal kind of revival that happened and was pretty excited by that. And I watched Daria from the 90s and the new Shira and Samurai Champloo and Legend of Korra, and just a few animated things because I was looking for something that um, I don't know would
It was different.
yeah push the TV kind of like medium like in different ways. I was looking for something that was more challenging and radical, and had not really kind of gotten back into anime at all, but was poking around, and I think I'd seen, online. I would see images of Utena, and I was like vaguely aware of it. I'd heard it compared to like Evangelion, so that got my attention. But I'm not sure what really got me to try it, except I was trying more anime in 2020. So at the end of the year, when I tried it, um, I was immediately kind of like knocked on my ass. I was just like, it had an immediate impact and got me so excited about the possibilities of the form, and that in 2021 and this year too, I've just like kind of really gotten trying to investigate anime and find other things that excite me. Not many that are like Utena exactly, but I've found shows that I love. Recently, Chihaya Furu, Flowers of Evil, first season of Sailor Moon, and shows. I was trying to kind of get my bearings in that world and trying things that I'd heard were good that I didn't always like Cowboy Bebop, the original, or Steins Gate, or there's a few others that I was quite disappointed with. So it's been Utena was kind of a gateway for me, but for the show itself, um, it was one of those that you watch and you immediately feel like something's shifted in you, something is vibrating differently, something's you get like inspired and just I don't know turned on in a way that very few shows, very few pieces of art in any medium do for me. So it was kind of like a turning point and just a real revelation at the time. What about you?
Well,
I suspect you got to know it a little earlier than I did.
yes, in fact, one of the reasons why I invited you is because the ages which you got to know Utena provides a different perspective than mine, since the way that a show would impact an adult in his 40s differs to
Uh-huh.
how it would do to someone much younger.
Sure.
And as for me, my initial reaction was interestingly far more I think the appropriate word is subdued because it I came across Uten as a teenager, and during those years, my interest in female-oriented media was not particularly high, much less animation for girls. Nowadays, that sounds silly, I know, but I think we are all a bit silly during our teenage years.
Sure. Sure.
And in any case, in spite of these reservations, I I watched a show called Princess Tutu, which is
Mhm.
about a ballerina.
Right.
And that did not seem my kind of show at all. And I only watched it to my curiosity to its inclusion of classical music. But to my own surprise, I loved it, especially the ending. It's
Mm,
still one of my favorites, and this
mm,
led me to look for other female oriented shows like it. And one of them was obviously Utena, and I really liked it, but I don't think I really understood back then what it
mm,
was about. I remember responding very strongly to it due to its inclusion of symbolism, which was something I was really into as a teenager, even though
mm.
I didn't really understand what they were supposed to mean. I
Sure.
remember not catching at all, for example, that Uten and Anthe were in love, which would have got me into trouble back then if I had interacted with the fandom. I remember thinking of it as really, really funny, something that I still believe. Yet,
Oh, I agree. I think, yeah.
it did not become a pivotal experience then. I think it was more respect than actual love for it.
Mm,
Then I
mm,
rewatched the show in my first year of college, and I fell in love with it so hard that it's still one of my favorite shows ever, and
mm,
especially the ending, which
mm,
never fails to make
mm.
me tear up in the
I
rewatches
agree.
that I have had over the years. Maybe
Yeah.
we'll talk about this more in detail later, but I get the feeling that the older you get, the more you see on it,
Yeah.
because the emotional response to the show depends on what you have seen in your life, which will
Mm,
allow you to see the show in a different perspective. Every
sure.
time I have watched Utena, my reaction has been emotional, but for different reasons.
Mm,
Though I suspect the reason why is because I am I don't even want to say this. I'm a cis heterosexual man who was raised in a religious family, which means
mm,
that many of the things that the show portrays as about feminine or queer experiences as obvious were not visible to me until I became older, which is
mm,
admittedly also quite part of the point of the show to
mhm, mm.
portray these things.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I wish
in
I'd seen it when I was your age, because I honestly, if I'd seen it back in the late '90s, I don't like you. I don't know that how it would have impacted me. Maybe it wouldn't have been the same revelation. I've changed a lot. There was a lot for me to learn, but it might also have like both like now been a gateway into like a much wider world of anime, but also just I wish I had had 25 years to sit on it, to like let it work its way through me, and I could have seen it multiple times instead of I've seen it two now, once, in December of 2020, and then once the second time the last month. But if I had seen it when I was younger, most things I see, I kind of just, oh, I see them when I see them, it's fine. And I very rarely ever think, I wish I had seen this earlier, because I feel, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like it might have sent me on a different course, artistically, personally, uh, gender wise, like allowed me to think through some things that it would have been helpful for me when I was younger. And I'm glad, I'm thankful to have it now, but I weirdly feel the loss of it. So,
That sounds actually really special. My Utena has helped me in different ways. I will probably talk about it later,
sure.
um, but during since I watched it in my first year of college, and a lot of the themes of the show have to do uh, with adolescence,
Mm,
and well, it's it's obvious that I would make a certain kind of connection with what the show is portraying, and
mm,
and then when I rewatch it, I realize that many of the things that I have seen in my life are in the show.
mm,
Uh,
mm, sure.
and the show helps me and the show helps me in that way to understand those
Right.
aspects of the world better. I will probably explain that a bit later,
Sure,
but
sure.
in any case, I think this last part is a good segue to talk about the show's communicative intent,
Mm.
because Revolutionary Cardutena is about a lot of things. So why don't we start with you, Tevis? What is, in your opinion, what the show tries to convey? How does it do this, and why do you think that it decides to use these uh, narrative or stylistic resources?
Okay, so this is, yeah, a lot. There's a lot I guess we can talk about here. I'm not sure quite where to start. I took some notes while I was rewatching this
Mm-hmm.
time, and I guess maybe to get what it's about is like we can work towards that, because I think that has a lot to do with the ending, and I, want to talk a lot about the ending. But um, I'll say that both the first time I was watching it and this time, it immediately strikes me how well the show works as a show, as a television show,
Mm-hmm.
as an episodic and serial narrative over time. Um, I never binged the show. I watched it one time a day in December of 2020, and then near the end, like twice a day, to watch it all in that month. And I've always like pieced it out. It would have been fascinating to watch it over 1997, week to week. I really I like to watch shows that way. I grew up watching shows that way, and I find that living with them in time does something different to the experience, and that binging doesn't quite do. And I don't think the show benefits from binging, actually, because the repetitive nature of the format and the ritualistic duels, and I feel like they can really bleed together if you watch them too much all at once. So yeah, I think that one of the ways that it works so well to express what it's trying to express, is through its repetition, is through an almost ritual-like quality to both the duels, you know the the whole like series of scenes with the absolute Destiny apocalypse, singing going on
Mm-hmm.
and all that. I mean, that's quite obvious. But I feel like the show too, it has its own rituals. I think that to watch the show, the introduction, the intro music, the opening song is absolutely a part of it. If you watch the show episode to episode, you see that 39 times by the end. And The opening, you said that we weren't clear that like Anthony and Utena were in love. I think that the show proper, like the what we think of as within the diegesis of the show, is not clear about that. Is not trying to be. But you watch that opening song 39 times, and it is so romantic and so swooning and so moving, and it tells kind of the whole story of the show in it too.
Yes, yes.
Um, but it changes while you're watching, and so I think the show works this way that like, and in some ways it's very straightforward, and yet the way that it works over time on you is to me really like harnessing some of the power of episodic serial television, both episodic and serial, and um, doing something with this because I think what it's trying to get at, both the abuse of Anthe and how one might get out of that, how one might like free themselves or be freed or revolutionize their world, is something that you cannot do all at once. You don't have an epiphany and then you're out of it, you're past it. It is something that you have to work through. And I think the show, openly dramatizes this working through. We have so many like, whether it's abusive or just bad ideas in our head, and you don't get rid of them all at once. Up until the end of the show, you're bought into like its drama, its imagery. Like even towards the end when Utena is, trying to be a prince, and you want her to be. You want her to change the meanings of these words instead of abandoning them. You want her to I don't know, you're still caught up in the fairy tales. Like the show is relentless in its retelling of its origin story with,
Mm-hmm.
Utena and her prince. It's relentless in its shadow girl, kind of interjections that destabilize everything. And it's relentless with its duels. um, but none of it's filler. None of it is something that would you could really remove, because to get at this difficult core that it's trying to get at, it has to not only repeat itself, it has to refract so that you're seeing the same problem through different characters, through Jury, through Mickey, through Nanami especially. And you are having to, I don't know, really grapple with it's hard to express in the show. uh, it grapples with this too. But how do you really get at some of the most deepest parts of your experience of the world, and then how do you, and including all of the bullshit, all of the toxic things in our head? How do you work through that and get somewhere new? How do you change? And I think that show in the title, hangs over the whole show. How do you revolutionize yourself and by that the world? So the first thing I just would say is that I feel like the forum is utterly, the show makes complete use of that, and we'll talk about the movie too. I know a little later on,
Mm-hmm.
and the contrast there to be made, but and that was something from the very beginning. When I saw it in a year and a half ago, I thought, I didn't know the story. I didn't know what was going on with Anthe. I thought that it was an elaborate working through, like a elaborate like coming out metaphor, and it can work that way too. But only when I got to the end of it, and then certainly the second time, really saw how from the beginning it was working through um, some of the most difficult ideas about ourselves, about deep trauma and abuse, uh, and how it takes time to work through that.
It's actually a very good point uh, because it's true that you don't just overcome traumatic experiences just through a simple epiphany. And you're right that the show benefits from its episodic structure because it allows the show to explore uh, different ideas for every character,
Mm,
and and that's something important for for what the show is trying to for what Utena is trying to accomplish, because it tries to uh, get us a perspective on these different forms of abuse or toxic relationships, and we and and the show is better for it. You said that there are parts of the story that couldn't be cut out. For example, I think the Black Rose arc, for example, is something that people usually think of as filler because it
mm,
doesn't advance the story.
mm,
But the show is better by having it because
mm.
we can see the perspectives of characters that aren't usually thought of in that aren't thought of for especially because these are not particularly uh, extraordinary people or the
That's
student council.
right, right,
They are people with their own dramas, and
right, right. That arc really broadens the world of it, not just to side characters, but to side characters of side characters. And
yes.
by doing that, I mean, the first time I watched it, I was a little frustrated with that arc. I didn't know what was going on, and I was so attached to the main cast that I was impatient. But the second time I watched it, I really too felt that broadened the purview of the show, allowed different ways into the same problem, expanded the world. I do think the end of that arc gets a little in the weeds about about history of the academy, and it complicates things in ways that I'm not sure always to a benefit, but the duels and the characters that it focuses on, I agree, it's not filler at all.
I actually personally think of the explanation of the Black Rose are like the history behind the academy to be also an important part of giving giving the show this particular this particular feeling because what happens essentially, like what happens with this character Nemuro, uh, we are supposed to see him as a sort of parallel to Utena
Mm-hmm.
because well he also has pink hair, but he's looking for eternity in the or he's looking for an ideal, and he can't let go the past, and well to and what happens to him at the end is that is is something that have is something similar to what we see at the end with Utena. We realize that Nemuro, after realizing the truth, completely disappears from the world,
Mm-hmm.
and well, and
That's true. I also think that it does resonate like you're describing, and it also, I think, it makes the trauma of Anthe, but also perpetuated by Akio, like not a singularity. It echoes back. You get a sense of generational trauma. You get a sense of history of trauma instead of one instance. And so I do think it succeeds at that. When you're trying to actually fold it into the story of Anthe and Utena, it can feel like I don't know what to do with this on like a narrative level, but in the way it resonates and what the way it, like we said, broadens the purview of the show and the trauma it's exploring. Yes, I think it does do that.
so I think something else that you mentioned before, like in our emails, was the importance of the character of Nanami. What
Yeah.
what was that? What was about that you wish to talk about?
Yeah, so I'm definitely a huge Nanami fan. This is the first time I watched it. The first time I watched it was the dub,
Hmm.
and actually I don't I think the dub has a lot to recommend it, particularly Utena's voice. But Nanami's was a little flat, whereas like the original Japanese, which I just rewatched in subtitles, was far. I, I don't. far more fitting to Nanami as I understood her as a character. But I definitely, the first time I watched it, loved her. You know, it was just an immediate, like, maybe I'm drawn to characters who um, are arrogant and I don't know, but also like insecure and she's so lonely. You know, I mean, I loved Asuka and
Yes, I was just going to mention that Asuka is also one of your favorites.
oh, I love Asuka and Misato, but especially Asuka. I particularly like. I don't love arrogant male characters, um, but I do love female characters who think they're the shit, who really push people around them, who but are also really moving. And I found Nanami while watching the show the first time in a world that is just, you know, Utena can be really challenging from the beginning in terms of how to read it, how to understand it. But Nanami was like this beacon of humanity. I immediately understood her. She was so human to me. She was the most like real character to me. Her dreams, her delusions, her delusions especially. I mean, from the beginning when she's trying to, you know, get at Anthe and all of her tricks go wrong, and she's full of just utter delusions that like blow up in her face. Till later on when you know the show really takes her pain seriously. Nanami's egg, and then ultimately what happens with her and Toga, is, I think, also very moving. And this is all in the frame of her being like the comedy character, which I particularly liked because I felt like that in this show, not only she wasn't comic relief, she was like a comic refraction or reflection of what was going on. You know, in many ways, you know, Nanami is uh, uh,
It's an even more extreme version of what happens perhaps to the other characters because she's
yeah,
younger.
yes, but also she's specifically the shadow of Anthe. She isn't exactly Anthe's position, right? She is in love with her brother. I mean, she makes Onishima like that constant exclamation of Big Brother, you know, just so horrific and you know and pathetic and every time she says it like her journey very much seems to be like I mean there's no it's no surprise to me that she and Anthe hate each other. You know, many of Nanami's, you know, things going wrong, her cowbell, her egg, these are like, you know, secret plots of Anthe kind of making these things happen. And so Nanami ends up as, you know, just to me, especially watching it a second time, just this double for Anthe, except she doesn't have an Utena. I mean, that little kid, Tsuebiki, like he's not exactly Utena. Um, but the thing about Nanami is that while she is like Anthe, she's on the verge of being an Anthe. She kind of saves herself. It's kind of remarkable what she does by the end of the show. That she faces um, her brother, her feelings for her brother. She, you know, she's the first to see Anthe and Akio together. She, from that point on, is immediately chastising everyone, especially Utena, of like, you know, are you stupid? Don't you see what's going on here? You know, don't you see they're tricking you? Like she, you know, she quickly gets like clear. She has a clarity about her. She says things that directly that the show can only say indirectly. Like, I mean, she really stands out, and it makes her comedic. But I don't think comedic means any less, well, tragic in her case, or any less like meaningful. I think the ability to, in yet another way, get at some of the trauma here through a mostly comedic character is a real like triumph of the show. And I think that over the over the time of the show, her development um, from you know Queen Bee, who is just as lonely we see as Anthe. It's another thing she shares with Anthe. They're the two loneliest characters in the show, and to see her kind of face her own trauma, to face her own situation, and to reject her brother, to uh, you know, kind of sling her truths when she is so deluded. You know, she is in some ways the least likely character to have not only see the truth, but to be able to act on it. So that by the end, I was like, writing a note to myself, like revolutionary girl Nanami, that she is got it. She does it all on her own. She's not even she doesn't even have someone else to really kind of help her with that. Um, and it's admirable, but it's also I felt like the combination of comedy and pathos with her was really unique and really I don't know the way that the show is able to look at its side characters and expand that view from its central Anthe Utena dynamic is best expressed in Nanami, and that by the end um, she's not only kind of heroic um, in her own for her own situation, but she is able to, in a show that feels the need to um, fracture and refract and be indirect about everything. I found her interjections of reality, her laugh, her wonderful, wonderful laugh, um, to just be really crucial to the whole working of the show. And she's someone who has, stays with me. I mean, I love Anthea and Utena too, but Nanami is special. I don't know how you felt about her because I'm not really tapped into the fandom for Utena, and I'm sure that she has her defenders and her fans, but I don't really know how she's seen.
Well, well, she's seen in a sympathetic light. You are, in fact, I think there are people uh, who see probably almost every character in a sympathetic light, except for maybe Shiori and Sayonji and perhaps even Aki. I'm not sure, but but she has fans, of course, and there is also people who have her as a favorite character. I do really like her too. I um, I I I remember that when I always find her episodes to be the funniest of the shows, the funniest of the show. I I remember once reading on Twitter that if the show had ended with both Nanami and Anthe leaving the academy, it wouldn't have felt out of place. And
Mm-hmm.
your commentary reminded me a bit of that because she also goes through her own character arc, and she and how can you say, and well, she the ex you're right that she's a lonely person, that you're right that she's a lonely person because no because she realizes that her the people who she perhaps thought as, I don't know, friends or even companions don't really like her.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yes. and and
And the show.
she overhears also her brother saying, I don't want to be with her, she's just a nuisance, and that hurts coming from
Oh,
someone who idolizes her. uh,
I know.
yeah,
That's that. Especially for someone who, there's something about what she clings to. She wants to be special. She wants to be better than everyone else. Um, but I think special is probably a better word for it because that hurts her so bad coming from Toga.
exactly.
Um, and but it speaks to me again in the way that she reflects, Anthe, that part of getting out of abuse, part of the appeal in an abusive situation is a feeling often of specialness, of uniqueness, right? There's something about you being the only one, even if it's horrible. And I feel like the show is very, through Anonymity, very honest about um, when you're getting out of something, it's not just about seeing the light, which she does, but it is about um, giving up that version of yourself, maybe parts of which you liked because the abuser told you things you wanted to hear, you wanted to believe, made you feel special. And her ability to by the end, she says, um, "My feelings were real." She doesn't deny that, like that, her love for her brother meant something to her. Their memories meant something to her. And yet she sees where they lead. She, more clearly than almost anyone, she immediately recognizes Akio and Anthe's situation and immediately rejects it. And she was headed down that path, and Toga was willing to flirt with that as well. Um, and Toga, is a wannabe Akio. I can't
Yes.
stand Toga, but I think that the only sympathetic thing about him is how he's like a pathetic wannabe. Like he's not a successful Akio, but he would be if he could. And so for Nanami to be in his thrall, to be able to extricate him herself before he becomes, fully like Akio, I is wonderful. It's moving. I there's something so, to me, moving about Nanami that makes my love for her just like uh everlasting. Like
In my case, my favorite character is Yuri.
mm,
Uh, but I think that the reason why her arc speaks to me um, is because we see Yuri as this strong, uh, cool character
right,
uh, who you wouldn't usually associate with falling into a abusive relationship, and
right,
yet she does. And in that sense, the show also suggests that anyone can anyone can fall into this,
yeah,
and,
yes, absolutely,
and that's very important
yes,
because when because something that happens when you are under abuse is that you feel guilt, and and you perhaps feel that it is all your fault, that you
right,
are weak for having fallen into this. But
right,
but with Yuri, what happens is that she's probably the best duelist in the show, and she's uh, she's
yeah,
also well
yeah,
admired by everyone, but
mm.
but she's dependent on the on Shiori, and well,
The show
that's that.
really
Sorry.
villainizes her quite a bit in ways that I'm not always comfortable with, especially in the movie. But yes, you're right.
Sorry,
Jury, like,
I couldn't understand very clearly.
oh, I just said that I thought that the show villainized Shuri, especially in the movie, a little bit much,
Yes.
in that I wasn't always comfortable with. But I did think that Jury, you see Jury, her situation in Utena's with Akio. If Utena also seems so powerful, so strong, so admired, and for her to fall for the worst man on earth, right?
Yes.
Yes, it can happen to anyone. Yes, it does. Yes, the appeal is it's not about being like strong enough or whatever. Nanami doesn't overcome through sheer strength of will. She has a strong will, but she is vulnerable. She is allows herself to feel things and be hurt, um and not just simply be the strong silent type. And that doesn't stop Jory either from wanting her
Mhm.
miracle.
So, um, so in regarding perhaps what the show is attempting to say, well, I think I have to be very careful in how I phrase this because it can be taken very wrongly. But in spite of the reputation of the show as very influential in the LGBT and feminist sphere, I am not 100% sure that the author has a primary intent to give a discourse about feminism, gender, sexuality, or at least it's there obviously. The elements are obviously there, but I believe that these are present in Ikuhara's works as natural aspects of his worldview instead of
Mm-hmm.
something that the author is actively trying to convey. And I
Mm-hmm.
believe this because Ikuhara previously worked on Sailor Moon, which is
Mm-hmm.
another queer coded show in general, which
Mm-hmm.
didn't really have this kind of discourse either, and yet these share very common elements in general, in particular with the film The Promise of the Rose. And also because Ikuhara has another show now, which is very explicitly about homosexuality, called Yuriko Maharashi. And that show is very direct and focused when it comes to the issues it raises and the experiences it portrays. And this obviously does not invalidate in any way how queer audiences perceived Utena, since the kind of representation it
Sure.
offered was notoriously significant back in the 90s. In fact, it is one of the boldest aspects about the show to me. It is very well known, for example, that the Latin American translation tried to remove many of these aspects, and once they got to episode 33, which is the one in the amusement park, they
Mm,
gave up and stopped broadcasting the show altogether.
really? Oh, I had no idea.
Yes, yes, because it was too much. The content was too much, and well, for example, stuff matters like lesbianism or even feminism were kind of taboo in Latin America in
Mm,
that era. Like if parents had seen it, they would have complained to the networks.
mm,
In any case, I think that as this these elements about the about LGBT representation and its commentary on feminine experience is a piece, but a very important one of what the show is getting to. And to me, at least, the show is primarily a coming of age story, very close to the notion of a German Bildungsroman.
mm,
It's very much noticeable when one observes the development of the characters who have to spiritually change from a childhood perspective to an adult point of view. And the show is well known for its tendencies to go to the abstract. But the iconography that the show itself utilizes already invokes these ideas of coming of age. The general motif of roses, which is usually a symbol of maturity in poetry, but also
mm,
the setting itself, which is a high school, the place
mm,
where adolescents are generally prepared for adult life, and the
right,
fairy tale aspect of the story with princesses, princes, and witches, generally
right.
associated with childhood literature. However, it is the implementation of these elements within the context of the broadcast of the show that makes Ikuhara's intent with Utena much clearer. So the thing is that Utena was released in the late 90s, which was a particularly turbulent era in Japanese history, since it
Mm,
is a period of time known as Japan's lost decade. For those listening to the podcast that may not know what I'm even talking about, the lost decade in Japan was a period of economic stagnation caused by the collapse of the asset price bubble in 1991. So there is a lot that can be talked about this era as of cause and effects, but the most significant aspect in relation to this topic is that this started a high unemployment rate among college graduates, which also caused the young generation to have a sense of uncertainty about their future as adults, or even
mm,
isolation in the form of reclusion. There was also a sarin gas terrorist attack in 1994 by
right.
the cult movement Om Shinrikyo, which also happened during this context. And for those who don't know, this is in certain way Japan's own 9/11. It's the most
Mm,
devastating terrorist attack in the nation, and
mm,
this was understood as the cult members losing contact with reality. So, in many ways, Japanese media, particularly that aimed at a young generation that was made during this era, was influenced by this anxiety. In fact, that is what Evangelion is about primarily. We know from interviews that director Hideaki Anno initially intended his show to be a response to Om Shinrikyo, as he felt too that this was a consequence of people losing contact with reality.
mm,
And Evangelion, as you know, deals with trauma and self-hatred that arises by a lack of a sense of self-worth, which
mm,
prompts its protagonist to escape from reality and create a painless world where he doesn't need to confront the contact with other people. And
right.
this show spawned a movement in Japanese animation and even related media, such as video games, which we can actually see in popular works from that era, like Ocarina of Time, with literally concludes in the step towards adulthood as a point of no return,
Mm,
or Final
mm,
Fantasy VII, whose
mm,
main character goes from a rural town to an urban place to accomplish his dreams of success, but he fails, and that
right,
ends up being a traumatic experience for him.
right.
So, Utena's status as a Bildungsroman in this era means that the show is directly concerned with this social anxiety at this point of time and belongs to this movement, which is further evident when one realizes that Ikuhara and Ano are really close friends and have similar perspective and values. The fact that its target is precisely young teenagers is relevant to this because coming of age stories, at least the ones I'm aware of, have an adult perspective on the topic. They look back on the topic. But what Utena attempts to give is to give a sort of lived-in experience, similarly to what Evangelion did for issues of depression and self-hatred, so that the audience who directly lives through this can understand this
Mm.
story instinctively. So this is what, to me, Utena is at its core. And through this perspective is that every piece in the puzzle starts to fit. There are So the thing is that Ikuhara, uh, for this work, has tried to invoke some sort of previous revolutions, previous revolutions that have happened in different media decades ago. I think you had a couple of examples, Tevis, with Dear Brother and Rose of Versailles.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, and well, Ikuhara's frame of reference actually goes even beyond that, uh, since the author decides to synthesize uh, these revolutions that were significant to him. I will mention some works, and you will see what I'm talking about.
Okay.
So, there is Damien by German author Hermann Hesse. It's a Bildungsroman that was very significant for young people that came back from the First World War who looked for meaning and orientation in life after a traumatic experience.
Mm.
And it involves fragmented realities, unclear and unreliable memories of childhood, an idyllic and illusionary world of infancy contrasted with the darkness of the adult world, trauma, lost innocence, surrealism, and allusions to apocryphal myths, in this case, the Gnostic concept of Abraxas, and an apocalyptic ending. There's also Funeral Parade of Roses by Toshio Matsumoto. It's one of the classics of Japanese LGBT cinema, and that one involves also trauma, abuse, allusions to ancient myths, in this case Oedipus Rex, exploration of gender and identity, roses as a central motive to the story, and also a tragic ending. There is also the general body of work of Shuji Terayama, who was a poet and a playwright and filmmaker at the in the 70s, with a couple of films being particularly significant. We have a movie called Throw Away Your Books and Roll in the Streets, which includes surrealism to manifest identity confusion in an explosive and violent way, and the descent of Japanese society into banality and conformism, and also a tragic ending. We have Pastoral, To Die in the Country, which also has intersecting fragmented realities, unclear memories, tormenting memories of the past, traumas, and lost innocence, in order to manifest a person coming to terms with his past. And even in animation, we have Belladon of Sadness by Eiichi Yamamoto. I think you have seen that one too,
Uh-huh. Yes.
which involves surrealist imagery to convey the path of an abused woman to self-actualization, and also has a tragic ending. So what you may have noticed is that most of these stories are works in the Japanese counterculture of the late 60s and 70s that arose as a consequence of a failed revolution at the time, the revolution of 1968, which was a time of worldwide scale series of protests that opposed, in very broad terms, a conservative social order. So the only work here that doesn't seem to fit, which is Damien, the German one, happened to be rediscovered during this period of counterculture. So, apart from the references and similitudes, we know for a fact due to interviews that Ikuhara grew up during this environment and
Mm.
felt a strong connection to the counterculture of the time, in particular to Terayama's works. And by invoking the concepts of these works, Ikuhara attempts to bring them into the modern era to show that what they stood for is still worth discussing, especially in the context of the broadcast of the show, to create a parallel with the sense of uncertainty back then with uncertainty of this new generation. Except that, unlike those works, Ikuhara has the audacity to attempt to bring this to a more positive conclusion, to a fulfilling conclusion.
Yeah.
That is, in a certain way, I think that's in a certain way a cause of alarm, almost a red flag even, because it's very easy to make that wrong, to do the wrong. But as you know and I know,
Yeah.
somehow he manages to pull this off. I don't know if I was more or less clear with what I explained.
Yeah, no, I think I got it. I don't know most of those works. But are you saying that the endings of all those works, when you say tragic, I mean tragic, I guess can go a few different ways. Are they tragic as in they're realistic, so they're about like, like failed idealism or like meeting like, the reality of the adult world and everything.
And all of them, and well, and they die, like they die, or horrible things happen to the characters because of the circumstances that they are surrounded with by, and
Right.
their idealism gets broken, or their promises, or life get broken. Perhaps you have seen some of it in Belladon of Sadness,
Mhm.
uh, which the main where the main character dies, even though she strives for in a certain way emancipating herself from. She dies at the burning stake. it, it so
Um, yeah, I'm just thinking about how the ways that tragic endings or failed revolutions, um, they can still obviously be parts of, progressive or revolutionary works, and then they can also be very conservative conclusions. I guess it depends on the work. And I had mentioned to you before, that while watching this, though my anime experience is limited, I have been trying to expand it the last couple of years, and two works that seem like direct predecessors to Utena, Dear Brother, and The Rose of Versailles.
mhm.
Uh, the show not only seemed to draw from them, but to reach a very different conclusion. But those weren't necessarily maybe tragic in the ways that you're describing that it influenced the director so much. Um, I mean, the French Revolution, there's only so much you can do with that ending in Rose of Versailles. Um, but I think so on a political level, I'm unsure what you can say about that, except that those two works, Rose of Versailles and Onishima, Dear Brother, are uh, to me very like conservative works in the end on a personal level. The Rose of Versailles, ends with our famous also like um, uh, gender challenging Oscar like Utena, not only falling for a guy, which Andre is nice and all, but is something that also he Oscar basically like finds her ability to go after the revolution based in her love for a man and what he would have wanted, and it just kind of like for all of its playing at um, challenging gender notions and it in the end kind of uh, is not only very heteronormative but like just becomes a more traditional story that then fits into history and takes on the tragedy of that. Dear Brother is well, actually that's a show that actually broke my heart because I watched it earlier this year
Mhm.
and loved it until the last like 8 episodes or so. And it has a happy ending, but it's one of those endings where I mean it it's a happiness at the expense of what was radical about it. It's a not only heteronormative, also very much so, taking its Utna character and its radical characters and really not only pairing them up with Dear Brother, the brother, but having a baby and the ending of that is really hard to take. But I think the bigger picture of what makes it not succeed with its kind of more revolutionary, I think, beginning and middle is that that's a show like Utena that takes adolescence very seriously, takes adolescent feeling very seriously, takes adolescence as a state of mind very seriously, and basically, Dear Brother concludes that it's a phase. all those feelings you had as a young woman for other young women, that's just a phase. All the things you thought you might do different, that's just a phase. Time to grow up, time to join the real world, the adult world. And that was so profoundly disappointing because of how hard it was pushing and how hard it was feeling its character's adolescent feelings in Dear Brother.
Mm-hmm.
And then Utena, comes in a very different direction and does not, until the very end, does not deny the feelings of its characters. And in fact, because it's a world without adults practically, there is one significant adult, Akio, and he's a nightmare. It shows it suggests an adult world that is a nightmare
Exactly.
and refuses it. And it doesn't just say like hold on to your adolescent fantasies. It wants you to see things clearer. It wants you to revolutionize yourself, but not in conformity with the adult world, not with certainly any heteronormative notions. It's wanting you to really challenge everything you brought into adolescence, but not the depth of feeling and not the rebellious like impulse that is usually discarded by the end of adolescence. So that I don't know if these other works, again, when you say they're tragic, how they're tragic, but there is something. It's not just that Utena has hope. Utena's the entire show is a process of how you might step into that adult world differently than other adults. How you might actually, see things clearer because of your adolescent feelings, not to discard them, but to take them very seriously and to say, in essence, the adult world ain't shit. And especially, I mean, this is not just generally adults. This is particularly the adult world of men. It is the patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
It is, I think a lot of its feminism is less in presenting some sort of idealized. I mean, Utena and Anthe are not idealized. They are.
Definitely not.
Their relationship is not. The final twist, there's duels throughout the show, but only one person ever actually stabs someone else, and it's the worst, and it's so painful. Um, that is, Anthony stabbing Utena at the crucial moment. But it is very clear-sighted, the show more than the film, I think, about the enemy, about. I mean, Akio he is one of the most profound to me, like enemies, evil men that I've seen, and he's not just like a stand-in for all men. He is, he's not just like a Lucifer. I mean, they do all that explicit like connection, but in the show, but he his sense of what it means to be a man, how a boy might transition into manhood and what they might take on, and what position that would put all women in their orbit, is the show is relentless about to the end, and sees no hope in essentially fucking with any of that, right? There's no you have to leave it, right? There's only you have to get outside that world, which might sound like a fantasy, but there are other worlds, and there are ways to get outside of the world of patriarchy, at least in your mind first, and then you can build that world with others. Um, and this show, I think, is much more. It works better. I'm not saying it doesn't work politically, but I don't think that's its ultimate aim, or when it's really looking at it, even when it's taking the patriarchy so seriously. This is not simply. This is not just to this is not political commentary. This is not. It resonates,
It
but
resonates, yes, but
it resonates, but it's meant to look at the patriarchy in you. It's taking very seriously all of that you have, taken deep inside of you into your stories, into your images and your ideals, and how you might revolutionize that. And I think that is rare. I think that Utena accomplishes something that, granted, I'm still pretty new to anime, but it is a regular problem for me to run up against the sexism present, Um, the all the remnants of patriarchy, the uh, the misogyny and the homophobia, and there's just many aspects in anime reflective of both Japanese culture and broader culture of the world that Utena. I think a lot of the queer coding and the like the wanting to see LGBT like stuff. It's not that it's not there; it is, but it's more in what it's pushing back against and opening up a space for. It's opening up a space by the end for alternatives. The truth is, we may want to see Anthe and Utena together, and certainly watching the opening song 39 times will make you think that, well, obviously they're in love, obviously they should be together, all that, great. But the truth is, when you're just coming out of abuse, when you're just coming out
Mm-hmm.
of sexual abuse, it's not. I don't think our first priority as viewers even should be like, oh, let's get Anthony and Utena together, like let's get them into bed, like that. Sure, like down the line if that's what they want, but like, but that's not. I find that kind of focus, and again, I'm verging on the movie a little bit, but like, I feel that seemed kind of wrong-headed. And while the ending of this was painful in many ways, um, it's not because it denied their feelings for each other. The truth is, like, in love, loving someone is many things, and what ultimately, you know, Utena, offered Anthe and the way they connected was a deep understanding of, you know, Anthe's pain, Anthe's point of view, Anthe's will denied throughout, and that is related to romantic relationship, but it's not the end of that. It's not all like there's the end. That's not. We're not. This show of all things is not interested in a happily ever after,
Mm-hmm.
um, in a fairy tale ending. Um, we don't need the shadow girls throughout to remind us of that, but they do. Like we none of those stories are the story we have at the end. In fact, we're left, you know, outside of the story of Utena, by the end of the show, we're left without hardly any familiar stories to use as like a model, and that's good, and that's part of the revolution. But yeah,
Well, I agree with what you said. I hope that my own explanation didn't give the impression that the show tries to give political a political agenda or something, because it's not the case. And what you're saying about uh, how uh, how the show gives space to these people is more or less related the to the fact that this is a natural worldview of the author, that it's present in his works in his works in general. Like perhaps you and and well, uh,
I'm interested in seeing. I have not seen his other like major anime series. I have seen now 2 seasons of Sailor Moon, and I know he was directing most of season 2. So I'm still kind of new to him as a director. But I think all the background that he's drawing on is all relevant.
mhm.
um,
And I wanted to add to that. Wait a sec. I also had some notes.
sure.
So I wanted to add to that, that since we are talking about revolution, perhaps since I drew a bit of the cultural context, um, if you are going to talk about of the revolution, you can't let aside the uh, the marginalized people, in which in this case would be social minorities or LGBT people, or perhaps how women were treated or women were considered before. And that's part of and that's also why these elements are included, and why these elements are a natural part of the world of the author,
Mm,
because because it because if he's going to talk about this cultural change, he has to include the marginalized people in. He has to include the uh, he has to include the women who suffer abuse, the the he has to include homosexual people. He has to include people who are gender non-conforming. It has to be there. It has to be in the conversation, and that's why, and that's part of what makes his work at the very least to me special, and that's one a big part of what makes his work special to me, and also special to a lot of people
Yeah, yeah.
who belong to these minorities.
Well, I think that's one of the powers of Utna in particular is that because of its approach, because yes, it is Anthe's story primarily,
Hmm.
more than Utna's. More, I mean, it is yes, and you could tell a more direct, um, story about Anthe, about what happened, about how she, worked through that, how she got free or freed herself. There's many ways you could do that. The way that the fact that that Utna takes such a metaphoric, at times surreal approach, and that it broadens and reflects its ideas through so many characters. It it doesn't take away from Anthe, especially in the end, but it also broadens that so it is not just the specific abuse here, but the ways in which, whether it's patriarchy or any toxic idea in our head, captures us, um, puts us into situations that are often abusive. Men too. I mean, I think the men in this show are pretty universally horrible, on purpose, and some of them are more
Yes.
sympathetic than others. I don't have any sympathy for Akio, but I can see how even someone as pretty horrible as Sayanji, is trying to feel something. And some really bad influences. Toga is even worse. When the men get the most power, and Akio has that, their desire to manipulate everything from a tower, essentially, and it's no good for them either. But I do think that the show, through its side characters, through Nanami, through its side characters of side characters, through its Black Rose arc, is able to create that resonance that, I think would bring in, you know, the very all the people who have been like subject to uh, the various forms of abuse that our culture does to us, that are, these stories do to us. It's I didn't even understand when I first watched it why, when I'm first watching it, when Anthe stabs Utena at the end, I'm dying. I'm like, oh my god, no. And yet when I rewatched it, I was still, dreading the moment, but I also watched it much more carefully and recognized how right before she does that, Utena is going back and forth. She may have freed herself from Akio, but she still wants to be the prince.
Hmm.
And we want Utena to be the prince. We like her as that. We're still like, invested in an idea of being a prince. um, and when she finally, gets the upper hand in the battle and, claims I'm going to be your prince, like that is her mistake, right? In some ways, Anthe is, stopping her from being the prince, is saying that no, that's not what I need. If you become my prince, then how will you be any different than my brother, right? How will you be any different than my brother was once a prince too? Look what happened to him. Princes turn into monsters, and her stopping Utena from doing that. Utena's, like lines as she's about to pass out of, I guess I really wasn't your prince. I'm sorry, Himemiya. like, it's there's something so powerful about, even to the very end, the way those notions cling to us. And it took being stabbed in the back to say, this is not it. This isn't it. Um, and I don't know. I think that the show's ability to do that up until the very end, and it disarms you as a viewer. And no matter what you're dealing with, whether it's particularly patriarchal bullshit or any number of other abuses from others or in your mind, and usually both, it man, its approach really pays off there. It really creates a space, not like a happy ending, not a oh Anthony and Utena are together, but it creates a space for the possibility of something different, right? The revolution is not just replacing, you know, the the old with the new. It's opening up a new space, a new world, and I think the show does that for its many viewers, and I think that's partly why it can hit you so hard because it got a year and a half ago it got inside me and it never let go really. When I rewatched it, I was just oh, I'm still vibrating on this frequency. I'm still like trying to open up that space in myself. I'm still trying to revolutionize my world. And man, that like its method, you know, not just serves its story, but it just resonates so broadly.
I realized that I interpreted the scene that you mentioned quite a bit differently. In fact,
Oh,
so when I saw, so well, first when I was saw that Anthe backstabbed Utena in the in the penultimate episode, I was also very confused. But then what I got out of it is that uh, Anthe was suppressed to so much abuse that she
oh yeah,
was willing to
yeah.
defend her abuser, and the
Oh
reason
no,
why she
I
backstabbed
agree with
her
you.
is because she's defending her abuser.
Yeah, that's true. It's they're both. It's totally in keeping with her abuse to absolutely
Hmm.
do that. Like she wasn't just having an epiphany and trying to convey that to Utena, but she was absolutely supporting her abuser. Yeah.
Yes, and that's also part of what I mentioned what I mentioned near the start that I listened to a lot of stories from my friends who endured very sad stories with their partners,
Mm.
and
Mm.
and and well, it wasn't until I listened to them that I realized that this is something that happens, and well, that scene with Anthe backstabbing Utena is some sort of visual reference that I have in my mind to how that state of mind looks like, and I don't know if that makes sense, uh,
Well, you
it's
mean
how
that like
it's what
it's a
helped me.
visualization of the way that you betray yourself in that, like that uh, abuse, toxicity gets so inside you that like you know her quote unquote betrayal of Utena, um, even though Utena moves past that and they still reach out to each other, and that's
Yes,
what's so moving in the
yes,
final episode. That even with betrayal, like Utena doesn't stop. She doesn't need to be a prince. She's just trying to help Anthe. She's just trying to understand, and that is where that's what reaches Anthe, not the prince trappings.
exactly.
Um, but yes, Anthe is, I agree. I saw that, and not only as much as I didn't want it to happen, did I understand, oh, kind of that, oh, of course. But I think a lot of the show works. I think I'd written you at one point about wondering about the point of view of the show. Like, how do we take all of it, what's happening in? It's a lot to process. The show is a lot. But in the way that, like, Nanami is a reflection of Anthe, there is, when I started my second viewing, I was so struck by my first viewing, the end suggesting that Utena disappeared from people's minds and from the academy, that it made me think, it gave me that moment of wondering, wait, is Utena real? That like, is Revolutionary Girl Utena just the Utena in our minds? I
well,
think,
that's actually intentional. I think that's actually intentional because since the show plays with these fairy tale concepts and
right.
references to myth, then the general feeling that you get when watching this show is that you are watching some sort of mystical space
Yeah.
where things like a giant castle in the sky where eternal promises can be accomplished can be true, or even the framing of some of the characters. Like I rewatched the show with my family this year, and one of
Mm,
the things that my family asked me is if the characters were dead, and
right. Sure.
yes,
I mean,
and
Uten starts in a coffin. Anthony is found. Anthony
exactly,
is found at the end in a coffin. I mean, those aren't accidents, obviously. So, like that sense of, the reality of characters, their uncertain reality hanging over the whole show, yes, that's everywhere.
Yes, and that's intentional because it's trying to contrast this illusion as this illusionary work, as I said, similarly to these other works that I talked about before. It's trying to contrast this illusionary world that is the school with the exterior world, which, by the way, we don't ever see. We never
Exactly.
see the exterior
That,
world.
yeah, that feels really important. Like this enclosed space, and for Anthony's final step to be to leave it like that. That yes, we don't have any reference to this space.
Yes, there are actually other aspects of the show that suggest this mysticality to it. For example, the fact that Akio and Anthi can appear or disappear in places, or that they trick people into they trick people. They're like these characters from fairy tales. Um,
Hmm.
so the whole show is already uh, filled with that idea. Um,
But it doesn't it also by doing that so constantly and undercutting our sense of reality or even a real like what real world might exist outside of the academy. Like it's constantly kind of pulling the ground out from under us and making us kind of look for somewhere to stand. This is not like a puzzle box show, right? We don't like solve it. It's not even saying is Utena real is not a matter of saying, well, what's the real story, and I'm gonna like figure it out. It's more trying to feel out how the mental and emotional spaces of the show are no different from the physical spaces they seem to inhabit. It's trying to bleed all that together in a way that doesn't um, there's not some secret to be revealed, but instead it's asking you to feel out, because we do this all the time in our own lives. Constant projection, constant seeing ourselves in others, constantly like negotiating a world that is, yes, physically present, but the subjectified way we live makes that all just constantly shifting. And the show seems to honor that and get us such that when you see Anthe betray Utena, and you think that Anthe has also betrayed herself, and there's so many instances in the show where uh, you read something that's happening with Utena as for instance, Utena, it's like the abuse is right in her face and she can't face it. Right? Nanami sees it the first night. Utena, and you could say, oh, she's in love with Akio. That's the problem. That is part of the
no,
problem, but
that that
she can't see things that are right in her face, and that resonates so true about both abuse broadly, because it's so normalized in some ways, but also because the things that are most important, her memory, she can't seem to remember seeing Anthe as a child, insofar as that's true. um, and so there's just this constant inability to face reality that strikes one as like, oh man, abuse. You don't need abuse for that to be true. I mean, it could be extra true, but like it is something that resonates and makes the entire show. Um, it keeps you on your toes, but it also just like with the Shadow Girls, who are like constantly undercutting anything you think with humor. Often they're like not. They're funny, but they tell so many stories. In fact, maybe the only common story they tell is that UFO imagery. Like, I mean, that's not even a story they tell as much as it's just the common, vision of escape, of transcendence, but they themselves work to constantly make you um, question every story, and you could feel exhausted, like, what ground do I have to stand on here? And yet there's pretty clearly throughout an emotional ground of and characters that you can hang on to. I do think the characters are very powerfully rendered. Um, so that yeah, it's a very unusual state to be in. So how did you answer your family's question when they asked, "Are they dead?"
hmm.
Did you just say like, "Wait and see"? Because I mean, it's a hard.
I told them that it's partially true and not true at the same time, because Because as you said, the coffins, like they are, and it's not just Anthi, but it's pretty much everyone who is suffering in this sort of purgatory. Like it's not literally purgatory, but it's framed like one. Like
Right.
this place where they are trapped, where they're trapped by their own. First of all, they're trapped by their own volition. They are there because they want to.
Says
They
that
want they want
yeah,
the eternity, uh,
right.
because
And
that's what
she's
they.
leaving says like to Akio, you can stay in your cozy coffin.
Yes,
And near the end, Sayanji directly says, everybody's in their own coffin. I
yes,
mean, like yeah, the show really like foregrounds that by the end.
yes, exactly. Uh, and there's also the apocryphal religious allusions, like for example the fact that Akio is Akio associates himself with Lucifer, which um, which is actually a bit revealing of what he's supposed to mean or what he's supposed to represent, which is um, well, in for perhaps maybe who doesn't know, Lucifer is in Hebrew mythology the morning star.
Mm,
It was supposed to be the beacon of light, what illuminates the world, which is more or less the function of, or at least how prince, the figure of the prince was initially described as a light in a world of darkness. The world of darkness being supposedly the adult world, and but Lucifer is also a fallen angel, and
right,
Aku himself is a figure of a fallen prince, of a fallen
right,
ideal
right.
that, uh, and Lucifer in Hebrew mythology tries to tempt people to stray from their path,
Right.
and through this Aku is also trying to um, stray people uh, from their own self realization to keep them in this prison that is the academy in this.
Right. Right.
So it's actually really interesting how the author brings these concepts, because it really reminds me of how Japanese cinema used to be, with the concepts of ghosts coming from uh, haunting people, and being specters, even vengeful specters from the past. And
Mm.
in a way, uh, an interesting aspect about Utena, that perhaps it's not that important, but it's how it tries to it manages to revitalize this aspect of Japanese cinema in a sense.
Mm. I hadn't thought of that.
So, uh, so the as for so what about, I think, the about the ending. I think we've talked about the ending already.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I mean, we could talk about it.
Yes, I just wanted
Well,
to add that one of the uh, most significant parts of the ending to me is that it's Ansi who has to liberate herself, like because Utena wants to liberate Anti from her abuser, but that's not how it happens in the end. Utena can't really reach Anthi and get her out of the coffin. It's
no,
Anthi who has to do it by
right.
herself, and it's
He helps her.
yes, and
She
it's
plays a role, but she can't do it.
exactly, and that's also how this how these things work. I think that perhaps if you are going to escape from a cycle of abuse, it doesn't necessarily uh, have to be uh, abuse from a partner, or if you are going to escape a cycle of abuse, it's
Right.
something that ultimately depends on you. And the conclusion of the show suggests that, or at least suggests that this power to revolutionize the world, uh, what accomplishes to convince a traumatized and hurt girl to realize that she had to keep living, and that she could live, uh, that she had to keep living outside of the outside of the outside of the academy, and outside of the of this fantasy world that she was stuck at, and that's such a significant thing to say, especially in the context of the broadcast of the show, because it's like you can because ultimately the show is saying that you can do that. Like
It is.
it is.
It is
It's
saying you can do that,
see
and it's saying,
even if you are oppressed or
yeah,
traumatized
yeah,
or you have endured so much pain, you can do that,
yes,
and that's such a powerful thing to say. Uh,
it is.
there's an interview with the author that rather recent from a few years ago that he said that people asked him what is what you want uh, people to get out from your stories, and his answer was freedom. I want
Mm.
people to fe- like I had the exact quote. I want people to feel freedom. I want I want people to know that it's possible for a person to be free. So I think that quote summarizes what Utena and generally the whole body of work of the author,
Mm.
but what Utena is ultimately about.
Right. And it strikes me that it's so, it's so easy in some ways to say that and so hard to do, and the
Mhm.
show is very honest about that. The show, it takes forever to get there,
Mhm.
right? It is not something you can just say at the beginning. And in many ways, there are many attempted escapes in the way that anytime you try to leave something, you have to leave it many times before it kind of sticks.
Mhm.
Like mentally, if you're trying to leave a bad situation, if you're trying to like change your lot, I feel like you have to keep leaving, and then finally you'll leave. You
Mhm.
will find a way out. And the show, through its different characters, through its duels, through its imagery, keeps suggesting escape. It keeps like gesturing towards that, but it takes 39 episodes and all of its work to get there. And that's why I felt like watching it that first time, something's being worked through here, right?
Mhm.
For Anthe, for the characters, for me as a viewer, because if you just say freedom is possible, or then and that can all just sound like all kind of, you could imagine someone saying that who's just saying it kind of like to pass you off and just kind of like uh, make it sound easy. But the show refuses to do that
Mhm.
and shows exactly how difficult it is, exactly how many dead ends and false leaves and all the things that lead up to it. And it's just really real about it's in the show is in many ways saying like, yes, liberation is possible, but it is so fucking hard, right?
It's really hard, but it's
And we're gonna
possible. Even
and you're gonna feel it by the end of this.
mhm. Okay, so we are already 1.5 hours in, so perhaps we should go to the next aspect, which is
Sure,
the next aspects are fortunately shorter.
sure.
So, is there anything you consider that could have been better in the show?
Uh, Not exactly. We talked about this a little. I figured talk to me after the first time I'd watched it. I would have just said the Black Rose arc, said a few things. But as we discussed earlier, I appreciated it a lot more the second time, and I feel like yeah, I just don't have like problems with it anymore. I see what it's doing better than I did the first time. I'm not impatient. So I can't really say that. I I don't know. I'm a pretty critical person, so I don't want to like let it off the hook. And as I mentioned to you before, I do have criticisms of the movie, so I'll have some there. But um, yeah, I don't know. Things that could be done better suggest like that it tries to accomplish something and it doesn't, right? That it doesn't achieve its own aims, and I just don't see that. I see, you could maybe, I don't know if you want to question what it's trying to do, but it accomplishes it so powerfully to me. And I don't know what would be better about that. It doesn't mean it's perfect or anything, but I don't really think about works of art that way. So I don't know. Do you have ideas? Is
Well,
it weird thing?
not really something major, right? Because I also have a certain. issues of this with the show, but they feel like nitpicks. Like
Okay.
if I could talk about something that I'm not a fan about the show, it's
Sure.
perhaps the animation, or because it's actually very low budget. You can
Oh,
really notice when they are cutting corners. But
oh,
I
yeah. I love that personally. I know it's low budget, and I really love what it does, like the style it achieves on such with such minimalism many times.
In my case, I actually forgive that because I'm aware that the show was conceived and produced pretty much outside of the interests of the anime industry by
Uh-huh.
an independent creative group. And there are also cases where the reuse animation sketches serves to make a point, anyways. For example, when Uten and Yuri fight, and then later in the show we see Yuri and another character fighting with the same animation, it creates a parallelism which suggests a similar relationship.
Yeah.
It's an interesting way to go around this issue.
But
Um,
doesn't
oh,
it also use a lot of like, I guess it's low budget issues, but like it's using some of the in its, like I described earlier, that ritualistic sort of,
mhm.
preparation for the duels. Yes, that's like, the same in each arc, each time. But I feel like that repetition is really put to powerful use. And even things like the recap episode, right? Those are, I know those are standard things in anime, and yet they're able to take some kind of like things that are just generally a part of anime and they twist it in wild ways so that the recap is actually a recap of Nanami's diary and like her take on it. Or crazy, like towards the end when it recaps the last recap they have, and then at the end they drop the bomb on you that the whole time Utena's been in the car with Akio and they actually like got together. What recap show does something like that? Like it's wild the way that it takes some of its anime like tropes and things like that, and then twists them so that like by repeating things, it does these little differences, or it just repeats something. That the Utena origin story is repeated so many times, and yet slowly it starts to change in your mind even before you hear the backstory from the Shadow Girls. There's something about its use of repetition that are budget saving, that are cost cutting, but it is used towards often like either like challenging or radical or ingenious ends that I was like constantly kind of surprised at how it could make use of those those constraints. It was basically making, you know, use of constraint. But
I must note the recap episodes are great. I agree. I must note what happens in the episode of the amusement park is not necessarily that Utin and Akio got together. Um, Akio abused her. Like that's something that has to be clear. Akio abused Utena in that scene, because if you see what happens, and then you see what is happening then on screen, like it's the letters on the on the on the I don't know what's the word, track pavement, on on the roadway, say
uh-huh.
no, stop,
That's
don't.
true. That's right. You're right. You're right.
That's not consent. It was never consensual.
Right.
It's more messed up. I think that's
That's
why
that's no, you're right.
it,
I had thought many times because the show is, for the first like two-thirds of it, there's the sexual, before you even really get into what's going on with Anthony and Akio, um there's just the hints of adolescent sexuality all around the edges, and then it starts to really go in. And it's contrast, in that episode, the recap episode, with Utena staying at home seemingly that night, and watching TV and doing worrying, thinking about different things, and then after she's talking about making lunch the next day, um, when her hair is all like splayed out, which tends to be like the visual signifier of transgression and abuse, and so that's all true in that scene. But I hadn't thought about it as explicitly. I mean, I had read it sort of as like Utna either um, going with it, uh, because later on, uh, Akio, in the last moment when she's questioning him, and Akio like throws aside his abusive auntie and says, "Oh, are you really upset by that?" And then he goes after her like, "What about what you did?" and stuff like that. but that's not any contradiction to it being forced at all.
In fact, in fact it
That
makes
makes
it
more
even
sense.
worse because
Yeah,
Akio,
yeah,
what Akio is doing at that moment is I don't know if the word's appropriate. I have just heard it that's the word as slut shaming. I don't know what's a more
yeah, yeah,
appropriate
yeah, yeah.
word, but
Sure,
it's
yeah,
he's doing that.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
he's precisely doing that. Like he abuses her, and then he does that.
Uh,
It makes the situation even more horrible.
right,
Uh,
and sadly typical. I mean, that's just like
yes.
not that weird. It's not that unusual. Like
Mhm.
it happens so often. It's like crazy, but um, yeah, like and so what you're describing. So that understanding of that episode at the end of a recap again, right? This is at the end of a recap episode, which are tend to be throwaway and
Yes,
fill,
but they are
right?
essential in this
Yeah,
case.
they're essential, and it's really redefining what we mean by recap. Like, what does it mean to recap something? Usually, that's just a clip show, but but if you have a show that is constantly repeating itself and changing, and then suddenly to recap something, to retell it, right? To in that case, maybe retell what actually happened more innocently than what actually happened. Um, man, yeah, it's doing a lot of work there.
And if I remember correctly, they also explain to you the motivations of the characters, and they lay to you clear what everything is supposed to mean. So so it's essential, and it also establishes some aspects about the world of Utena in a way that seems foreshadowing. For example, I remember the first recap episode has introduces us to Akio and the Prince Dios. So,
Mm,
and we never saw him before. We don't know who he is, but
right, right.
we but it is established there that those two have a connection, a pretty obvious one, but they have a
Yeah,
connection.
sure, sure.
It's not something that people can skip. Those episodes are essential. Um,
And it's definitely something that the second time you watch the show, or even when you finish it and you think back, you recognize. Like, for the first time I watched it, and Akio does not show up until after the first arc.
mhm.
And so here is this story of Utena's origins with a purple-haired prince, and I'm just thinking of Anthe, and I'm just thinking like, I obviously I didn't know Anthe had a brother yet. I didn't know like what was possible. But it's funny how like what what connections you'll make until you fully understand it, until you see like a prince becoming like a rapist is something that like the show it doesn't it it doesn't look away from at all, and yet it brings you into an understanding of that yeah,
No, I get what you mean. I get what you mean. Um,
yeah,
in any case, another point of contention that, or well, I don't think of this as a real drawback, but rather as a limitation of the show. Because I don't think the show really attempts to do this, but its representation of LGBT issues or feminist issues can be a bit limited in for certain minorities. For example,
mm,
the experience of queer people of color is completely absent in the show. Even if
mm,
Anthi is a woman of color, she's
mm,
not necessarily written like that, but instead she
right,
and
right,
Akio are represented as mystical creatures. You could
right,
even argue that Utena, like the show, falls into the mystification and exoticization of race, perhaps unintendedly so. I don't think that ruins the show. I don't think it's really intentional at all because the show is Japanese, but perhaps it
yeah,
can create a sense of disconnect towards
sure.
queer people
I
of color.
That was something that I wondered about because I didn't I didn't understand. I'd seen a few comments online of people saying that it was taking up at the time in the mid '90s that there was um, a lot of tropes, anime tropes involving um, characters of color that it was aware of and pushing back against. And I, having not seen a ton of anime from the '90s, was not sure what it was referring to, or how much it might be something like that. Because on the surface of it, it does. tend towards a sort of a particular kind of Orientalism in the mystic in infusing sense. But I also, when I read some of those comments, that it was maybe this was just like a Utena defender saying that it was, subverting something. I was like, subverting to what end? Like, I'm not sure I could see what it was doing with that, and I didn't, understand exactly what. I mean, I suppose you're saying you don't think it does anything but kind of like follow um, some of those tropes and doesn't do anything.
I think it treats its characters respectfully. Obviously, it treats Anthony respectfully,
Yeah,
but to to the topic of uh, queer people of color being anti queer people of color, um, it doesn't do much or anything at all with that experience, and it's understandable because
yeah,
Ikuhara is not a person of color. He is, and well, he doesn't have that first-hand experience. He doesn't even pretend to that, which is actually, which you could say it's honest from his side, but it's limited on that regard. Uh,
very limited, and
mhm.
it does make you question whether, when you have those limitations, you approach a work or a story with those in mind, and that suggests that, yeah, I'm not mindful enough because I'm not. Yeah, yeah,
Other than that, I don't really think of anything significant that I don't like. Like the voice acting is usually in each anime for me, I must admit, but here I don't feel that. And the starting chapters can feel kind of silly with how they resolve if one watches them out of context. Since the fact that Utena draws the power of Dios to win duels feels a bit like a cop out, but they don't bother me on rewatches because it's explained how it works. And I've also heard people having issue with the sense of humor with the show, which kind of puzzles me because this has
yeah.
to be the show that I laugh the hardest with. Like you have elephants starving, girls turning into cows, boxing kangaroos. How does that not work?
I mean, I agree. I don't know what people are not finding funny about it, and like, funny not in just like a, oh, I'm laughing, but like in almost all those, especially the Nanami, because she gets a lot of the humor. Um, they all seem to me both like undercut with some sort of like pathos or feeling, but also they seem to reflect like a lot of the animal humor. I mean, animals are kind of in the show Anthe's domain. She's known as an animal lover, right? She loves animals in a way that suggests she hates humans. Understandable, perhaps.
I didn't think about that, but you're right. You're actually
Right,
right.
they're Anthe's thing. Like she talks about them a lot, and in fact, they haunt Nanami through Anthe's doing. Anthe sends the cowbell. Um, so there's that's true too. But the use of animals, the animals to me are often like some of the funniest things. The kangaroo, the horse, they're trying to escape, right? And they're getting stopped, right? And that is, again, Anthe herself. If we read her connection to these animals, her relationship to them, and we see these animals suddenly breaking free and then, being stopped or, causing like hijinks or humor, they get kind of deflated and undercut. But there's something about these runaway animals that, like the show does for most everything, seem to just uh, resonate with some of its broader aims. And
Mhm.
and yes, they're funny.
I also think that it fits. I think that most of what the TV shows fits with its aims, anyways. So uh, so now the next question would be about the movie, and
Can I
I
just say before we move on, it strikes me that like some of the questions about the humor, I wonder if some of the not finding it funny suggests like finding it out of place, like that especially given what the show is all about, that some of the humor can come off. I don't know if it doesn't work for some, if they find it like incongruent or insensitive or something like that. To me, I feel like it is specifically the power of humor to get at very difficult things, very uncomfortable things, and not just to lighten the mood. The show doesn't need its mood lightened, but it's trying to go at something very hard, many ways. And in my experience, to get at something humorous or even absurd at times is also to get at something profound about life, about how we work things through. And I find that especially on rewatch, like a real strength of the show.
I find it audacious from the author to not take the tone of the story so grave, because so serious, or I don't know if that's the appropriate word, because when I think of other of my favorite anime, perhaps I think Evangelion, or I think, I don't know, Princess Mononoke, or
Mm.
I think, I don't know, a lot of them are serious and dark
Mhm.
stories, and even dark stories like Evangelion is famously dark,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
well, but Utena uh, tries to accomplish similar aims, but it does it without really over overwhelming the audience with a serious tone or with a tragic tone, and that's unique, or at least
Well, it's got
that's
a more varied, right? It goes, it has a vision of life and of pain and of tragic like
mhm.
experience that's a little broader than narrowing it down to, you know, the experience of suffering is yes, it's all consuming at times. I know that personally, but the world that you inhabit and the world that you are trying to negotiate with while working through trauma is not, a relentlessly grim one. It
Mhm.
is not a. It is varied in the way that life is, and there seems to be uh, a broader vision at play here that I really appreciate in Utena because I think its vision is much broader than Evangelion's, and
Yes,
I love Evangelion, but yeah, so I think that humor is a part of that.
and I love Evangelion too, but I think that at the very least, the comparison between Utena and Evangelion is that Utena gets to the gets to its aims in a way that seems to me more believable than the TV show, because the TV show, I love the TV show and I understand the love for the ending, but in a certain sense in Evangelion I feel it a bit like a cop out, like this sort of epiphany that doesn't seem that all that realistic, and it's inspiring,
Yeah, yeah.
but uh, but
Well,
it
I
would.
think Evangelion benefits from its film um, in a way, and I love the ending of the TV series and the film, but it does something very different than the film of Utena does. So maybe we can segue to the
Mhm.
Utena film because I think that there are pretty strong contrasts.
Okay, so which differences do you see in both? Uh, so which difference do you see between the movie and the TV show when it comes the Utena movie and the TV show?
Okay, well, and again, we I mentioned before that I did not like the movie,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that you did. So I'm sure we're going to have different views on reading the movie. And I'll draw it to Evangelion. I should say up front, like I tried to watch the movie. I did mostly watch it right after I watched the TV series a year and a half ago, and was immediately put off by it in a way that shocked me. I was coming off such a high from the show, and then I watched the movie and was just like, oh my God, I don't know what to make of this. I really don't like it, and I don't know why. um, so then when I rewatched the series this past month, at the end of it, I also was like, okay, I'm going to rewatch the film, and had emotionally a pretty similar reaction, but I think I understand a little bit better why I don't like it very much. And I should say up front, like I don't fundamentally understand why it exists. And I say that because I I understand financial reasons that anime movies exist in relationship to anime series. But beyond that, I don't fully, and this is speaking to my anime like newness. I don't fully get sometimes the relationship of anime films and anime shows. Um, I I encounter them sometimes, and I don't. I think Evangelion's an exception, though not the rebuilds, which I can maybe contrast to Utena too. I don't get that. Um, so I don't. Maybe you can address like why it exists in a minute. Um, I would say that just briefly, given everything I said about why Utena works so well as a show, this obviously does not apply to the movie.
Obviously.
Less than an hour and a half. Clearly, some of the things I love so much about the show can't be present in the film, and thus it, it's got different stakes, it's got different methods, and ones that for me just really don't add anything, and in fact undercut a little bit about the ending of Utena that I like so much. I find, just like I said, I love the low budget constraint that they work with in the show. I similarly really do not like the lavishness of some parts of the movie. They aesthetically put me off, and they create a world. It's weird. The world in the movie is both more realistic in some ways that it shows the mechanisms behind things, the moving parts. It doesn't take place like in a abstracted, planetarium like fooled space. The fights, right? Even the duels are in the Rose Garden, which is a place and a burial ground, or they take place in front of the school. So this weird, use of like increased like realism and increased kind of like unrealism, where the ending obviously with the and everything. But instead of the show, which I think has this really interesting tension between, a school that doesn't look like most schools, but there is sometimes a mundanity to the, little school life elements or the visions of the town outside of it. And then these, abstracted wild duels and everything in the tower, like you're constantly asking yourself watching the show, like, wait, what is the world? What's real here? What's going on? And in this case, it creates an uncanny feeling. Whereas in the movie, maybe it's because not enough time passes, it just felt discordant to me and kind of like, again,
Clearly not real.
Yeah, but not. The show is real and not real in a good way, and this felt real and not real, not in a good way. Again, time may be the major factor here. Obviously, I didn't like that Nanami got turned into a gag.
I imagine that.
My girl was, just a joke, but not a funny joke. And I tried to have a more sympathetic reading of like, what is this show doing? Because in many ways, the Anthe of the movie is, closer to Anthe at the end of the show. She seems more proactive. She seems more self-realized. And so I thought, oh, this is more about Utena, because Utena, she has her own, prince to exercise from her head. I at one point thought, oh, is she imagining Toga, and who, him being really dead is and forgotten as like what she experienced in the show, and processing that. If Anthe ever finds Utena, insofar as Utena is real out in the world, Utena may not be ready. May need to go through her own stuff. She just was getting to some new places at the end of the show. So I was trying to like be sympathetic there. But I think by the end I found I found the car thing so off-putting. Partially,
yeah.
Because I didn't find it visually interesting at all. But it was one of those cases where the car so clearly, becomes the mean in the show. It is the vehicle of the man of Akio and the man's world. He takes you on a drive. When you hear the car engine in the last arcs, you get nervous. It's like, oh shit, like the car's here. And it's, yes, it's a means of escape that seems to be driving on the outside of the school, but it is so clearly identified with the problem of men that the show takes so seriously, that to try to take it on and to like um, reclaim it feels like one of those cases of like the trying to use the master's tools to destroy the master's house, and I don't think that works. So and you know, it also the movie in going in the car chase like loses sight of the enemy. There's many enemies, but in the show, it's pretty clear about the problem of men. It is really insistent upon it through Akio, but through beyond Akio too. And here, the prince is dead. It's simply, you know, it's both like too abstracted um, into ideas and not instantiated in the story or world or characters. It's like, you know, the car drive and the final image of Akio is just so not real. It's just so like idea that I that seemed like much less effective. And I think overall, and this is where I think it diverges from Evangelion, it seemed to me to offer the kind of fantasy happy ending that the show denied and that I didn't want. Yes, I want to see. It's not when people say I just want to see Utena and Anthy happy. I get it. I feel that too. I love them. You know, I want them to be happy too. But that wasn't precluded by the end of the show, and by making it explicit here and by making it so kind of heavy-handed in its words and in its vision of empowerment, um, it you know the show opened up a space for liberation, and this one kind of embraced it very ham-handedly in a way that I just didn't know why it was necessary, and instead it seemed to like undercut the series a little bit, saying like the series, the show wasn't enough. That ending, which I thought was so amazing and perfect, wasn't enough. And instead, we need this additional thing to underline what we already know and to give you the feels. And I didn't, not only didn't have them, those feelings, but was really put off by this happier ending. So I guess that all that to say, like, you know, Evangelion is quite the opposite in the sense of what it offers in the film. You know, I think the
Yes.
film and the last two episodes of the show stand side by side as both, you know, both real in a way. But if the show offered a happy possible state of being that Shinji could come to by the end of the show, and then the movie offers a vision of the world when Shinji is not good, not healthy, not realized in the way that, you know, or if that realization at the end of the show was short lived and he went back to his catatonic masturbatory, you know, state, and everybody suffers for it. That was a much better turn for me. Those exist in a tension to me that's both more interesting, and more like the movie really sticks it to the fans in certain ways. Oh, this is what you want? Okay, I'll give it to you. Now, are you sure you want this movie? um, and Utna is like giving fans, I feel like, what they want. Similarly, like I think the rebuild of Evangelion movies that came out and concluded last year are really quite bad for many reasons. But they also want to revise and find a happier ending while not only sacrificing some of the virtues of the show, but also sacrificing characters like Asuka and Misato, which is like unforgivable to me. But that too had a similar impulse, and I think it's that impulse. When I say I don't understand why it exists, I don't understand why the rebuilds exist. I mean, I get it, I've heard, I know, but I don't really know artistically, like for loving Evangelion, and this similarly with this. I can't figure out why this exists given the show and what I think it does so well and given love for it. So maybe you have like a better like understanding of why it exists and how it works. But it's more than a happy ending that I didn't want.
No, no, you are right that it's an unequivocally happy ending, and well, if it helps you, you're not alone in your
Okay.
states of the movie because
I thought the movie was popular. Is it not?
it, it's let's say that Ikuhara is a very divisive
Yeah.
director, so naturally, uh, his works are either loved or considered pretentious garbage. And even people who like him may or may not agree which are the good ones. Like, there's people who don't like Utena and prefer one of his other works. Or there's people like me who likes most of what he has done.
Mm.
And, for example, the one that I couldn't get behind was his latest show, Sarasamai. And that's one is the most popular of him after Utena. But my friends love it. And, well, it's very divisive. And Utena as a group of work in general has also its own division because there are so many different iterations. There is the TV show, there's the comic book, there's also the movie that you just talked about, and there's the comic book of the movie. There's the video game. There are musicals, and there are theater adaptations.
Yeah.
So which one is good or not is also its own point of contention within
Oh,
fans. So you're definitely not alone when
okay.
not you're definitely not alone, and I don't think you are a killjoy or anything by thinking that. It's fine. It's completely fair. It's fully understandable. Um, okay, so and it's if it starts you, this is the only ending in Utena's in Ikuhara's works that is unequivocally happy,
Mm.
because the other ones. Okay, I think I'm spoiling you a bit by saying that, but the other ones take more cue of the ending of Utena. So
Okay. Good. That makes me want to see them more.
on the other hand, I'm not sure if you would like them, but that's another topic.
Maybe that's true.
Anyways, I uh, I'm not 100% sure about the motive of the existence of the movie. As far as I'm aware, the movie was conceived by the director by the end of the show, like after, shortly before the release of the final episode.
Okay.
Um, and one of the main one of I think one of the main concerns or one of the main things that happened during the broadcast of Utena is that there were a lot of people who refused to believe that Utin and Anthi were in love. Like, for example, what
Oh, really?
similar to what happened to me, but it's in my case I didn't realize that, but in other cases people didn't want to accept that, which is why the director decided to make the relationship more overt. And
Mm.
also, I think that he wanted to not, in a sense, he felt like the television format uh, didn't allow him certain things. So that I think that's why he made the movie.
Mhm.
Um, like for example, there is a lot of content of the TV show that is implicit, that is that in the movie is more overt. Like we see that it happens.
Right.
Um, so so as for
Doesn't
so
that often happen when a show, like a director wants more, a bigger budget, more time, or like a different, they want more tools when instead, I'm not sure creators often recognize how what they did with the tools they had was so amazing and that in fact comes from those constraints and instead, having a studio, big budget studio album after your stripped down album and might not be the best idea, but okay.
no, I think I get what you're getting at, and it's true. Um, so my take on the movie is mostly that I don't really divorce it that much from the TV show, which means
Mm.
that when I think of Utena, I think of both.
Okay.
And there are certain aspects of the movie I can that I personally personally make it easier for me to watch. For like, but there are obviously aspects that I prefer from TV show, like the characters, like you said, which get the shorter end of the stick here,
Yeah.
or the fact that the film is intertextual to the TV show because it's very difficult to process the movie without the TV show. I watched it,
I
also
bet.
watched it with my family this year. We watched the movie first and then the TV show, and my parents had a hard time processing what happened since a lot happens on screen, and the film uses visual concepts out of the blue without
Yeah.
establishing them like the TV show did. And it
Right. Right.
wasn't until they viewed the TV show that they understood the film a bit more. So I think that one can understand the film on a more complete level if they pay a lot of attention, but the TV show definitely makes the process easier. But
Sure.
nevertheless, I think that's one of the main drawbacks of the movie.
Mm,
Um, I think that our perhaps our different perspectives on the film may probably arise to what we got out of the show to begin with, because as I said, I generally took Utena as a coming of age story, and the film attempted to distill that concept first and foremost, and
mm,
the film the film is more overt in its portrayal of lesbianism, as I said, but it
mm,
does not attempt to explore anything of it at all. So
mm,
naturally, people looking forward to further explore representations of femininity or
mm,
LGBT issues won't get that, since the film, with its short duration, reduces everything down to Uten and Anthi having the
mhm.
epiphany that they're living in a fantasy world, and they decide to escape from the academy to the real world, which is why the climax is the chasing sequence, and
Right, right,
mhm,
right.
and the
And that,
fight, and that's why
typically,
also the final obstacle is the giant fairy tale castle, the giant Disneyland castle, which
right.
so there are one of the most interesting aspects about the film to me as well, at least in relationship to the TV show, is how it reshapes in a certain sense the figure of Akio and the prince in general. Like we have already covered the association of Akio and Lucifer in the TV show, but in the movie, Akio is associated with Beelzebub, the Lord of Flies, which is
Mm,
probably an even more radical take on him, because Beelzebub is a derogatory term for this pagan god called Baal, which calls
mm,
it pretty much excrement with flies as followers surrounding it. So
right.
basically a false idol. And with this in mind, the figure of the prince is implied now to have never existed, that this light has never existed. It has always been a false dream. And this changes a bit of the focus of the discourse. So not just to break out of oppressing systems, but also to reject them as false, as something that was bound to be doomed from the establishment, which is, I think, how Ikuhara attempts to utilize this iteration to further add to the conversation about the figure of the prince.
I mean, I. It's interesting, but it also makes me think about how um, when it's so, Beelzebub, like, is, doesn't work through seduction, um, like Lucifer, doesn't work through, like, doesn't, it can be hard to understand the nature of that evil, because it's so obvious. Like flies in and dung, like they tend to be so off-putting, and there's something. It doesn't work to me in the way that the show is able to really both, dismantle the prince, but to show why you believed in it in the first place. Like there's something about taking you through that process of disillusionment, but you have to feel the illusion first. You have to feel the draw. Akio may be a rapist, but he's awfully powerful and seductive, and Utena feels that, right? And Anthe once upon a time thought something different of her brother. At least it's, the Shadow Girls, and it said that in a few ways. Whether I think her past is a little hard to parse sometimes between all the stories, but in any case, like working through getting free of like Beelzebub is like, I don't know, like obvious, or it's there's something. Yes, it uh, is a false idol and something that is never going to work, but it's like a false idol from the start. There's not much work to be done to like see it for what it is, compared to Lucifer. But
Yeah, I think Aki is definitely an actual character in the show, not so much in the movie. So that's why.
he's dead. I mean, like that's a, interesting. I have to say, interesting that the prince has been dead all along. There's something true about that in a way. The prince in the show is truly dead too. It's all fake princes, and they literalize it there. Like that could work, I suppose, given some more time, or it's not impossible that it would work.
I also uh, I also somewhat so I think I differ from your take from the end because I actually enjoy the last sequence. Like I
Mm,
enjoy or at the very least the image of the fairy tale castle crumbling, and then that that a rose that a shower of petals reveals the real world,
mm,
and the real world ends up being an apocalyptic wasteland where
mm,
everyone who has uh, who has been there has crashed, and they just drive further to the in this apocalyptic future, well, in this apocalyptic wasteland. That's like the ending is happy, but it's also uncertain in a sense, because
and-
they end up.
right.
Sorry.
I think you're right. Even the castle flashes in and out in the background at the very end, as if it could come back, or that it like could threaten in some other way or reassert itself. But the wasteland quality of it was more interesting to me, even to think about the ways that like it's not like when you escape your prison you're thrown into a paradise. You're not like escaping one world and into the outer world and it is welcoming you, or you're ready for it, or it's bountiful. That's not the case. So I did like that aspect. It is showing, I think that tonally it is, the wasteland doesn't land very much. It's not. You could imagine a different story where people get outside their prison, and then it's like a big like deflation to like see the world destroyed. That's, I guess, in many stories. But here, not only is the tone so up and up, but you've had the other characters that we like say we're going to get out too, right? So there is this, you know, that's an, it could be a nice gesture. I love that Nanami seems to have mentally gotten out in the show, and I wish the best for Jury and Wakaba and like some of the others. But yeah, they're just as much as the Wasteland is an interesting like thing to come into tonally. I don't know how we feel anything but just kind of like triumph and glory.
but it's but it's a it's in a certain ways a triumph. Like you get out of this prison, and even though you face this wasteland, you are going to keep going. Like
Sure, sure.
that's I think that's what Ikuhara was aiming for in that thing. Like it's but I can understand why it doesn't appeal to you, and why it doesn't why the movie doesn't appeal to you in general, because it, as I said, as we said, it's very different from the show stylistically.
Mm.
um, so uh, so do you have anything else to add about the movie that you wish to say?
Um, no, it made me a little hesitant. So I haven't read the manga. I haven't read the after story. I haven't seen any of the other media you talk about of Utena, and the movie made me a little hesitant. And I'm not sure what to do with that. Like, I don't want to. Anytime I love something, it makes me nervous.
Okay, so a quick rundown.
Okay.
The manga uh, is very conventional. Like it's full straight shoujo anime. It's shoujo manga. It's it's very conventional. You are not going to get the same out of the manga as you did from the show.
Okay.
So that's one.
I was afraid of that because I've had that experience with a few other manga I've tried of shows that I liked, and what I liked about the shows wasn't obviously present in the manga.
It's a completely different story, even because it's a completely different story. So
Yeah,
it's
isn't it more toga stuff and like
yes,
okay, yeah,
yeah.
I
So
mean the toga of the show is someone I'm deeply uninterested in, but outside of Nanami, and I they did, I assume, I don't assume, but they the thing they did with him in the movie seems, I don't know if that's related to the manga, but his own trauma and abuse, like I was curious about that, then it just kind of went away in the movie, or just kind of they left it, but I didn't know where that was from.
Okay, so the backstory in the so I think that the screenwriters and the director, I'm not sure who said that, but they said that the backstory that we from Toga that we see on the movie is supposed to also apply to the TV show in a sense. But I don't really buy it, but that's what they said. So uh, and well that's it. That's the thing with the backstory.
Mm,
As for other Utena media, the video game was not done by the same creative group. In fact, it was released, I think, at the end of the first season, or at the end of the first arc. I mean, so and it's kind of a dating thing. So it's not. It's also a bit different, but it's not as awful as one. I haven't finished it, but it hasn't been as awful as I thought it would be.
mm,
Uh, I haven't read the rest of the media of the Utena media. I didn't want to read the manga of the movie because I had enough from the because it's the same author as the manga from as the other manga, so I had enough with that. Um, so that's and the theat and I haven't seen the theatrical productions because they are not translated, I think.
mm.
So I haven't had the opportunity to read them yet. And the after story I haven't read it. But the things that I know about it make me a bit suspicious, like
Okay.
stuff that happens with Toga and Miki. I I will try to read it, but I'm suspicious on that one too. Uh, so
Okay. Well, you're. Yeah, I feel warned.
okay.
Um,
So the next question that I wanted to ask you was, which current relevance do you think that Utena has 25 years after its initial broadcast?
hmm. Um, yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best to answer that more because I don't. I'm new to it and I'm new to anime. So, like, what was happening in 25 years in anime or in the world, I'm not sure. I do think it's not like I think Utena. I don't believe in like timeless works. I think that works, speak to us in different times, and I think Utena has a lot to express, and thus I think it, has lost nothing in 25 years. Certainly, some of its um, concerns with patriarchy, um, with trauma, these are the princes in our mind. They're still there,
Mm-hmm,
right?
yes.
Um, uh, Women are not liberated, and in a different way are not either. And so, and seeing, as I've tried different uh, anime the past 2 years, certainly there is still real problems of sexism and just even. I'm not connected to the anime community, obviously, but the little I've tasted of it reminds me in ways of the video game community, which I'm much more familiar with. I sometimes will read, like I was watching Chihaya Furu and reading the comments underneath the episodes, and just those some of them were okay, but so much just this like, who should Chihaya end up with? Like relentless. The show is not about that, and I was just getting like, oh Lord, like what are you guys doing? I don't. So what I'm saying is that I don't know. I sense sometimes, as with video games, that I'm coming to anime maybe for different things, for different reasons, or that I just am not aligned with a lot of the fandom. So that's all to say, Utena still feels very necessary in the world of anime that I'm learning about. I mean, revolutions of any sort, personal, political, take time. They take repetition. They're ongoing. And I do think that what impressed me so much that I said at the beginning about Utena's form as a television show, that it has a lot to kind of like still challenge us with formally. And I think that it, where often said about in the the television shows are quite ascendant right now with so many streaming and I that's true, but I feel like given how Utena the show embraces its form, embraces the television medium and both episodic and serial storytelling, that it has I don't want to say a lot to teach us. I don't like that language, but it shows us so much that like there's so much still to do with that form. Like you don't need to convince anybody today that like television is important, but um, you watch a show like Utena, you watch a show like Twin Peaks: The Return, and they're so formally exciting, and not just like it's not like a formal experiment. Utena is so its form is so deeply rooted in what it's trying to do, and it does that so powerfully and it like I'm not saying other forums couldn't do something interesting with the same concerns, but man, Utena uh, just I don't know. It makes the television form like it makes me like I said, it made me get into anime, made me excited about like oh, there's a whole world out here, and so I feel like there's still so much that television can do that episodic serial storytelling can do, and Utena both reminds me of that and kind of like still points some ways forward that I don't think most most shows are certainly not taking up, but they could. It'll still be there. And meanwhile, like on a personal level, a year and a half later, I mean, I wish I had 25 years to like marinate on this show. Like I wish it had been running through me for 25 years because I feel like I would have created different things. I mean, I don't think that about many things, but I really think it could have opened up some things in me and like done, not, I don't know about send my life on a different course, but maybe, there's something that powerful about it. And so that kind of potential revolution, I think is available to anyone who watches it today. I watched it in 2020, and that is, you know, I don't know if that's speaks to relevance, but it speaks to its power, and that hasn't diminished.
I agree with what you're saying. First of all, you're right about the anime community. It's there are similar issues with the game with the anime community as there are in the gaming community. I don't know which one has worse issues. I think both of them go hand in hand because
They
both of
feel,
them
yeah,
are based on Japan. Are primarily their fandom are based primarily on Japanese uh, franchises. So it's well, anime is Japanese, so it makes sense. But video games, but people became fans of video games mostly by Japanese stories, and
yeah.
still do. So it makes sense that there are issues there. Um, so as for the staying power of Utena, I agree with what you say. That those everything that Utena was talking about 25 years ago still exists regarding uh, patriarchal institutions and what well regarding patriarchal institutions and in my case related at least to my understanding of the show, the fact that Japan's lost decade became afterwards Japan's lost decades in plural
Mm,
means that we can talk about the last 30 years means that the show's view about the cultural side of the era is still ongoing. In fact, uh, Ikuhara made a late work called Penguin Drum, Magoro
mm,
Penguin Drum, which is about the generation that was born from the children that grew up during this decade and still and lives nowadays. And well, that's a bit of its cultural relevance. But however, from a Western perspective, at least to me, the aspects uh, that speak to me now are involved with its portrayal of abuse, especially towards women. So, I correct me if I'm wrong because not I'm a bit young, but I think that nowadays people have more tools to recognize cycles of abuse and to take up action upon it than they had before. But precisely because of this, is that it's possible for the show to resonate more directly with people who understand these patterns and behaviors. And well,
There's different language for it now that's more broadly out there, it seems, than maybe at the time. I'm without saying that things have gotten any better in many ways. There's a different, like, yeah, like I said, language.
exactly, it's it's thanks to that that people can perhaps recognize those patterns in Utena and perhaps learn from it, learn from that experience in a way that perhaps wasn't possible in 25 years ago. Uh, so I told my experience that are about how I perceived Anthi backstabbing Utena, and well, I didn't go through a abusive relationship, but this was the story that helped me internalize the testimonies of people I heard
Mm.
from. This was what helped me to have a visual reference of what these different stories can look like. And well, in at least in my personal case, whenever I hear one of those stories, it really makes me hurt. Like it really brings me pain. Like in a way that seems physical, like in a similar way that what happens to me when I watch Utena. Like I can't watch I rewatched the last episodes and I was really really feeling strong pain to for what was happening to the characters. I don't
Yeah.
know if that makes sense, but it's
No, absolutely.
okay.
It doesn't have to be. It can be your own experience, obviously, but like I people very close to me that I love very much who have experienced uh, abuse that I understand some things about it that the show I think gets very right. Even in the way that it is possible to still love someone who abuses you, and how part of getting free of that is in disentangling that love, and that is very difficult and very um, just very hard. And so the show's it's not just that it doesn't surprise me about Anthe stabbing her, but like what Anthe really has to grapple with in the loss of her brother, the loss of that prince. And it's been going on for a long time, but yeah, it's very. The last few episodes, I didn't. The first time I watched them was with fear that I was afraid this wasn't going to end well, and by well I mean not happy, but it wasn't just going to do a good job of ending. And with this time, the dread with which it came, and yet then while watching it, um, yeah, it's there's so much going on in those last episodes that has lost none of its power, and in fact, every time both times I've seen very new things will resonate with me. There's a point where Akio says, like, I think the prince image of him says something like about how the power that he hopes to gain is used, and then Akio cuts in and said, is for me to decide. And he's talking about, Anthe's power is for him to decide how to use. And with Roe v. Wade like falling in the U.S., like I was just getting such power. Like it was like, oh, like fuck, like there's something there in that power, in that him, the man, getting to decide what to do with that power, that just went all over me. And there were so many. Remember when Akio, after he kind of gives up on trying to open the Rose Gate, and Utena pushes past him, she has this wonderful moment of like putting his hand in his face and pushing it away. And Akio goes and sits down and slurps on a drink. And you can just tell, like, it's just a game to him. Like, oh, he'll try again. He loses nothing. He's still, his position is assured. And he sat there kind of like, blase, just sort of like slurping. They have that slurp sound. It was like, I was flashing to like I don't know if you watched the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearings in the U.S., but the indelible sound of men's laughter during like abuse, and the indelible sound of that there was so many little moments that are just like ringing through you. And the show, in its ability to push inexpressible things into forms, sometimes expected, sometimes unexpected, that will just, like I said, I've been vibrating since the show, and it, yeah, it actually, even thinking about it, can like I can feel like my eyes, like it's just incredibly powerful.
So, I think that we have already talked 2.5 hours. Like
Sure.
it's been longer than estimated. So we should probably start wrapping up the discussion.
Yeah.
So, which conclusions can you draw from this conversation about Utena?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not good at like conclusions of big conversations. I don't know. Do you have ideas?
Well, what do you think that you got out of this conversation, or what do you like, or what do you get, perhaps, out of Utena, or if it
Well,
is.
mhm. um, I mean, you're really the first. I'm kind of watching anime alone. Like, not only not a part of the community, but I don't have anyone to talk about it with. Um, and um, so hearing about your experience with Utena, I mean, I guess there's a sense of, even though there's differences, like, uh, I don't know, I like to hear about others' experiences and how they resonated in some ways, like similarly to mine. So I don't know, I take heart in that in some ways. I think that what is in the second viewing and in preparing to talk to you and listening to all the different ways it works, I keep coming back to something about time and something about, yes, as I said before, that in Utena's format, it really taking advantage of that. But uh, Utena, it is to me not about epiphanies, right? It's not about this moment. It is, there are moments that are important in the show, but um, to reduce it down to that um, is seems not only wrong to the show, but wrong to to its concerns and to what it's trying to get, work through, and that working through requiring time and requiring, whether 25 years or 39 episodes, uh, feeling out the work of revolution personally and beyond, and what that takes and how it doesn't end, how many times you think you've revolutionized your world only to find that you are still in that world. um, that, I don't know, coming out of this, that keeps kind of like echoing in my head. So
Well, in my case, well, Utena is one of my favorite shows. Like, I think it's pretty clear right now. Sometimes I actually think it's my favorite in general. Like,
mm,
and it's always fascinating to me for me to talk about it with people because it helps me realize how differently it can resonate with them. Moreover, this also has been an opportunity to try to get everything out of my own chest, and I also hope that our perspective has been of help for people to get interested in the show or
mm,
understand it a bit more. In many ways, I feel like we could keep talking about it a lot more because it's so much, but I also kind of had to compress my thoughts on very broad terms because
sure.
the show does so much. Like we haven't talked, for example, we haven't, for example, talked about how the show handles the concept of time itself. Like we you have mentioned time as the resource, but the thing is that in the show it's established that time doesn't pass,
Yeah,
and time
right.
doesn't pass, and this is related, and the show connects time, fairy tales, and death to suggest that not being able to leave this behind is some sort of spiritual death, and we could talk about so many things that this show does.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
It really, episode by episode, like when I was like taking notes, I was like, oh, there's too much in each episode. Like, you can't get into the nitty gritty of even the arcs, but let alone like what
what every episode
each
means.
school is trying to do, or each Shadow Girl play is trying to do.
Okay, there were some questions from the audience that were asked in Twitter in anticipation, so perhaps we should try to
Yeah.
run through them. Okay, so the first one was asked by Erika Niwatori. She's a friend of the podcast, and
Mm.
asked, "What is the role of the soundtrack in Utena, and what is its importance?" Do you have any thoughts on this?
Not a lot. I hope you do, because I think the thoughts that I have are more about the opening and closing songs and the like Absolute Destiny Apocalypse chants for the duels. Like I said, there is to me the our shifting kind of reading of the opening from, and I do think that the opening is a clear part of the text. It's not outside of it. I mean, even some of uh, the previews of the next episode would include scenes that didn't show up in the next episode, and yet seem to have be referenced later, like the scene where Anthe tells Utena, "Don't you know how much I've despised you?" Um, so there's things like that, but all the stuff around it is a clear part of the text, and so the use of that opening song to kind of both tell the story, yes, in miniature, but to keep the image of Anthe and Utena in your mind throughout, and to like express something that the show in itself can express, is quite wonderful. I like the trend. I like when the show shifts in its ending song from um, the what's the truth, the
Truth,
first song,
yes.
and that I maybe it's a bad translation, but I was always struck by that. I want to be hated by lies, and how weird that formulation is. Not to hate lies, not to see lies for what they are, but to be hated by them. I haven't figured that one out, but I like that transition to that final song, that keeps ending on repeating "empty, empty," and all the astronomical like language that is so tied to Akio and is like fallen apart by the end. But I'll say that in the show itself, the use of the songs of the chanting like during the duels and leading up to them, I always found pretty powerful for the ritual things I described before, but also because the language of those songs tends to um, bring this personal, emotional duel into like a metaphysical realm, right? All of its language, gestures into this, it heightens it metaphysically almost. And that to me, just, it spoke to me about this essential connection between self and world, that metaphysics, not as something out there, not as like, some ontological like reality that supersedes us, but the language of a world that can be revolutionized, but because a world comes from self, comes from person, and the show explicitly goes after world, uses that world language at the end when Anthe's telling Akio, Utena's not in your world anymore, and I'm leaving, this world, and that use of world there um, has a, yeah, I mean, sure, it can have metaphysical resonance, but it's clearly talking about personal worlds too. And so I just kind of love that its ability to heighten these personal conflicts into world ending, end of the world, end of the self, like kind of stakes. As for the score, I didn't take really notes on that and have a lot of thoughts. Maybe you do, but
No, me neither, because I just think that the piano helps with the general fairy tale feeling of the show
yeah.
that it's attempting to establish, particularly the track, the Sunlight Garden track. However, I have also a few words about the tracks with chorus. So the thing is that these songs were composed by a person called Takaki Terahara, also
Mm,
known as Julius Ernest Caesar as a professional name. And this composer was a member of a theater group called Tenju Sajiki, which was founded by Shuji Terayama. And this person was the primary composer for Terayama's plays and films. And well, this and the thing is that by utilizing the compositions of this musician, what Ikuhara attempts to do is also to bring another part of those stories of those stories of those previous revolutions, sort of, that I mentioned a while ago. Uh, those two movies that I mentioned,
Wow.
Throw Away Your Books and Ride on the Streets, and Pastoral to Die in the Country, both of them feature have this composer as well, the main composer, and they also include these songs. Of course, the purpose is very different. The one track in Utena that reminded me the most of the style of those movies was because, as you said, the purpose is its own in general in the duels, but the one that reminded me the most of those movies was the track "Missing Link," which plays when Anthi is impaled by the
Mm.
swords of
Mm.
eternal hatred of humanity, uh, which is a very traumatic experience to feel, because it's and the music in that sequence um, doesn't necessarily require you to understand the meaning of the lyrics, and
Mm.
it doesn't really feel like an ornament. It really imposes a tragic quality to what's happening on the screen, and that also happens in those stories, which also have their own
I see.
traumatic uh,
Mm.
traumatic attributes.
Mm.
So that's also that. Of course, I'm not contradicting what you're saying. I'm just adding
Yeah, yeah,
to the
sure. I
conversation.
don't know. Yeah, that's my experience while watching it. I don't know much of the background of those songs.
Okay, so the next question was asked by Emiko Niwatori, another another friend of the podcast, and she asks, "What do we think about the inclusion of concepts of divinity in the show, and which meaning or significance do they have in the story?" I think we talked about this a bit already with the figure of Lucifer and Beelzebub, but perhaps you have any further thoughts on this?
Um, Not really. My general sense is that I don't think it's um real significant in the way that like Evangelion uses some Western religious ideas, and I mean it's maybe a Japanese take on those, but it takes them into kind of the world of the story and what's actually happening in a pretty serious way that asks you to contemplate some of these things. I don't feel like Utena in its mentions of Dios or Lucifer, they seem like touchstones things, but they don't seem as deeply interwoven, at least in my experience or reading of it. It feels to me like a lot of that language is you, especially like Dios and the Prince, is there. It's part and parcel of the whole breaking apart and finding the emptiness inside a lot of these words, or the danger and toxicity in them, in these concepts and these bad stories we have in our head. It seemed to me it didn't have. I didn't read a lot of deep comment in that. I saw it more in line with among the many kinds of stories and words that the show, the Shadow Girls, the they were constantly kind of deconstructing or pulling apart, so that by the end, Dios, which when I first heard it, oh, that must be significant, felt very empty to me. It felt very much like it had been gutted over the course of the show, and I didn't see much more. But did you see something more to it?
Well, I usually associated those as symbols of what I mentioned as symbols of fallen angels that attempt to explain uh, what a part of our or the role that this character of Akio is playing in the
Mm,
story. It doesn't
mm,
necessarily mean that the story has a religious commentary. On the other hand, perhaps I think that perhaps the story can have applicability to people who are in religious groups, particularly in cults,
right.
um, because that's its own cycle. That's its own um,
Yeah,
So yeah, that's its own
very hard to
total.
extricate yourself from. I mean, my own religious experience, like to to trade out the story that a religion will tell you or give to you, enforce upon you, and to trade that out for a story, a world, maybe a wasteland that has no story or that you don't know. Like it is very hard to leave that. It is very hard to leave certain those stories, and I think the show, resonates with that very much.
Exactly. And um, what did I want to add? Um, the no, I think that's pretty much it. Like if no, I no, the thing is that I talked before about the connection of this cult Om Shinrikyo with the zeitgeist of the zeitgeist of the era, with the context of the era, and thus per, the people who live in cults, like the people who are oppressed in cults or in religious in extremist religious groups are also part of this conversation because they are also part of a they're also outside of the margin of society. They have also their own stories that
Mm-hmm.
we must consider, and they also perhaps uh, uh, need to break out of these beliefs uh, that oppress them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so the following asked question was asked by Danny Canovas Lodo on Twitter and asked how you were introduced to anime or manga, but I think you responded that already. If you read or used to read manga, I think you talked about it a bit, and which ones do you plan to read next? So perhaps do you wish to
Yeah,
say?
I think I've said it about kind of my anime background. Manga continues to kind of elude me. I I have read some like full volumes that I have like liked quite a bit. I a few years ago read uh, Yuichi Yokoyama's Garden, which I loved, and anyway, a decade ago read A Drifting Life by what was it? Yoshihiro Tatsumi, I think, and a few others I've read recently that were pretty that I liked. But I have to say that I've certainly never gotten into manga. I've tried. I'll see a show like last year. I watched Berserk, the '97 version. I watched Land of the Lustrous. I watched uh, Flowers of Evil, which I loved, and then went to the library and tried the manga, and in no case did it compel me. To some degree, a little because of reading. I'm reading Berserk is like a huge undertaking, so I'm not sure I can commit to that. But even the little I read, and then the other ones, I just was like, oh man, whatever I'm loving in these shows, I'm not getting. Am I not? Do I not know how to read this? Am I not literate in some ways? Because my experience with like comics in America is limited. I'd never been like a monthly superhero comic reader. I love Sandman in the '90s. I love Linda Berry to this day. I used to be into Chris Ware. I guess they're mostly art comics, but um, I never developed many habits for that. And I will, still read graphic novels today, but um, manga, I don't know. I'm looking kind of for a gateway, like Utena was for me into
Understandable.
anime. But manga, I haven't found it yet, and when I've tried, I've kind of been I don't want to say let down, but I just feel like I'm missing something. I don't know what that is.
Well,
I'm open, but I
to,
just don't know.
to what you said about Flowers of Evil, even the author of the manga thinks the show is better.
Okay.
So even the author of the manga agrees with you. So
Yeah, manga wasn't bad, and it had many of this very similar story and even language, but something.
in my case, I barely read manga, so I don't really have a say on this. My
Okay.
favorite is Nausicaa of the Valley of Wind, but I
Mm,
didn't finish that one yet. So,
mm,
but I really, really want to read Fruits Basket.
mm.
I I've heard things about it that make me interested. It's
Hmm.
it's described also like to be like Evangelion, so uh,
Oh,
so that in a sense that it goes to places of emotional complexity in teenagers, and well, uh, I'm interested on it because of that.
yeah, sure. I tried the Evangelion manga back in the 90s and couldn't like get into it. So I don't know. Maybe I just need to read some manga that I have no other reference for in a different medium in anime. And like I said, I've read a few, but they tend to be like, I guess, more like full, like a single volume, like um, I don't even know what they're called, art manga. I don't know.
One
So
shot, one shot manga, you mean?
yeah, yeah, they don't seem to be ongoing series. Not that I don't couldn't appreciate that, but yeah, I need to find something that'll tip me over.
So the next question was asked by Aeneas SVS from Twitter and asked what about anime caught our attention, which ones impacted us the most, and about which other anime or manga you could talk about, perhaps in other podcasts. Again, I think you have described a bit about this at the start, but you can respond further on this if you wish.
Yeah, I feel like yeah, I could say that the anime that I just finished that I'm like thrilled about and is not over is Chihaya Furu. And it's ongoing and so it's not over yet and I'm tremendously excited about it. It is the best anime. Totally different than Utena and its strengths are totally different and yet I think it's quite amazing. Um, so I'm very up on that. Of course, as I said, I loved Flowers of Evil last year. Sailor Moon, I'm slowly working through. And I just finished Dirty Pair from the 80s and quite liked it. I was not expecting, I mean, not that not expecting to, I didn't think I would like it as much as I did. So I'm still kind of like, still looking for things. And like I said, I have found some things that I don't love that many people do. So I kind of still I know why I don't like Cowboy Bebop and Steins Gate. But I'm interested too in kind of find those tell me a lot about my values and what I care about just as much as those that I love. So I don't I'm not sad that I watch things that I don't like. I don't mind that. But yeah, that's I'm still like I've got a long list of things I'm trying to either watch or find or um, so I'm still exploring.
Well, in my case, I started watching anime as a 4-year-old because that is what was on TV. And my
Mm,
first anime was called 3000 Leagues in Search of Mother.
mm,
It was directed by Isao Takahata. And it caught my attention because it was very different from other children television I was aware of. It was the story of this young boy who wanted to see his ill mother and went uh, through great lengths, like he crossed the ocean just to see his ill mother. And well, that was very different from other children television I got to see at the time. And then some years later, I got to watch Evangelion, which, by the way, was weirdly aired alongside other Saturday morning cartoons in my country. To make it clear, we had Evangelion and
how old,
Pokemon side to side.
how old were you when you saw Evangelion?
7.
Oh my god.
Insane. But that
Oh,
changed everything for me. I think that if I had to talk about anime that really got me the most, that I love the most, apart from Utena, I love Princess Mononoke uh, by Hayao Miyazaki, Grave of the Fireflies by Isao Takahata, and Pat Labor 2 by Mamoru Oshii. Those four are like my personal canon from
mm,
my favorite anime directors too. But when it comes to TV shows, Evangelion is an obvious one,
mm,
and Yuri Kumarashi was also another one. Since that one actually changed how I looked at something in real life. Although, admittedly, that's one that I can't recommend easily because it's by Ikuhara, and as I said, he's a divisive director. I can't guarantee anything with him.
right.
Uh, so the following question was asked by Ruben MG1997 from Twitter and asked if and how Utena has impacted your own writing, particularly the visual novel you're writing currently. Uh,
Right. Um, So in some ways, this is still unknown how Utena's impacting me. Like I said, I wish I'd had 25 years to be impacted on it by it. And for a year and a half, it has been a work that's just so present in me. And so I'm still feeling that out. There's something in it. It's not like this is the first work that, works in metaphor and works it works like it does that I'm familiar with. I've certainly loved uh, David Lynch for a long time. I wonder if how I would have seen Utena back in the '90s, like I saw Laura Palmer. Anthony and Laura Palmer, I think, have a lot to say to each other.
That David Lynch was one of the primary influences for Ikuhara too. So
Okay, well, there it is. um, and even back then, like one of my first loves growing up as a teenager, musically was Tori Amos, and her songs deal in very raw but often wild imagery that yet sometimes doesn't make sense to me, but then it sometimes like lands so hard on me that it just knocks me out. And so there's a way of working through pain and experience an image that I was kind of primed for, and that in some ways Utena seemed to like reawaken part of me when I saw it a year and a half ago. It was like, oh yeah, I was really into some of these things back then, and so trying to kind of like reacquaint myself with that. I'll say more generally that like my own work tends towards two extremes. I'm both dedicated to a kind of hyper realism of experience and daily life, and yet I'm also really drawn to heightened realities and kind of magical visions. So I tend to vacillate between those two or try to combine them. I'm not really into like genre trappings or trope stuff or nerd shit. like there's something in between that is occupies a lot of like artistic work that just does nothing for me. So in the visual novel, I've tried to bring together some of those hyper real and heightened reality together with some formal experimentation. I've certainly been in playing games a long time, so visual novels partake of that in a way, but I think the visual part of it has excited me. I will say that like I'm no longer working with the artist I was, and that's been kind of a blow to momentum and sort of my original idea and working through some of these things visually and not just through language. Things like the chorus, the Shadow Girls in Utena certainly were like directly inspirational and made me feel like, oh, you can get at something with all these different ways. I knew choruses more from like Greek tragedy and stuff, but it made me think about those differently. It made me think about uses of humor and how that can. I'm a terribly serious person most of the time, but how that might refract and do some work. I think it also like really made me kind of want to go all in narratively in my fiction on women's relationships. That I don't just mean romantic. I mean the relationship of sisters, of mothers and daughters, of friends, and feeling that both as a person whose gender identity has like been coming unraveled their entire life, to really recognizing why I respond to Utena and Anthe, and why because I as much as I want them together, like I the difficulty of that, the difficulty of connecting with someone, the backstabbing, the bickering, the differences. I'm interested in all that, and I'm interested in specifically in the context of like how women relate to each other. So I think that I've embraced that in the visual novel and am trying to embrace it in my own life. So yeah, that's kind of where it's working out. It's unfinished, both the visual novel and Utena's work on me. It feels like I feel like I'm at the beginning of it, and I'm not sure where it's going to take me. But,
Interesting. Now I'm excited for the visual novel.
well, I hope so. Without the artist, like it may become a non-visual, just novel, and that's a different thing. I am the formal experimentation in Utena was so important and so crucial to why I think it works that it puts a burden on a visual novel and a novel that's not visual are totally different animals, and I want to do things that those the form needs to match what I'm doing. It needs to express it specifically. So I hope the visual novel can happen. I can't do it all on my own. I'm not a visual artist, and so I don't know about that. But it's leading somewhere. I mean, the best I can say about it is it's leading me somewhere forward. And we'll see. Utena's still got work to do on me.
The next question was asked by EVB9073 from Twitter and asks if and how Utena has impacted your life or your own philosophy or worldview. I think you have talked about this a bit already, but I don't know if you want to add anything on
Uh,
this.
my philosophy and worldview. I think, as I said just now, it has like pushed me to think even further about gender, my own, and why I've always responded. Like I know I would have. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure I would have loved Utena back in the day too. I have, um, for me, stories that are centered not just on women but on women's experience. On like that, there's something about that resonates at the deepest level for me, and my own understanding of myself. And so Utena is definitely, in some ways, echoes something I've been feeling most of my life. And so in that way, it's, encouraged me, I guess you could say. I still have plenty of, whether the patriarchy or otherwise, just plenty of like princes and bad ideas in my head to exercise. I do think that the show more generally has kind of seeing how something that could have gone so wrong because that kind of formal experimentation and stuff like it's a fine line between something that is profound and then something that strikes you as meaningless or completely failed. So I know the risks there, but seeing Utena do it is encouraged me like as far as taking artistic risks and experimentation, trying to basically get at some sort of radical change, revolution. I that as an aspiration is just something that I'm always looking for revolution, radical change in my life. And I would say finally it's weirdly reignited my love for television as a medium. It's I've always been interested, and I've had ups and downs. And after Twin Peaks: The Return, it took a few hits, and I think we all experience, with the different media we encounter, you get like to a point where there's no video games that are of interest to you. There's, all music is failing you, and TV is weirdly my oldest love. I recognized this recently when I was thinking about when I was a kid and like before I could read, before I had much access to games, before I much had access to movies, because movies were something that you had to go to in a theater. I mean, there were barely even tapes to rent when I was young. But before all that, there was TV. TV was like my first like media love. It was there, and I interacted with it in a weird, in a way that it was present. I didn't go to it; it came to me. Right? It lived there in the room. Shows came on their own schedule, not when I decided. They lived in their own time. They happened week to week. There was something about it that was very intimate to my life, and yet formally, I barely understood when I was younger, but had this potential to tell stories and to live with characters and ideas over time that I really responded to early on. And then, I found other things. I could read, I could play games, I could see movies, but TV never went totally away. And so Utena, yes, it got me into anime more, but it has excited me about episodic television, serial television, just the possibilities, and yeah, that was not expected. So
Yes, in a certain, I think I feel the same way because when I think of my favorite television shows, they are usually very short. They're usually miniseries. So Utena is actually the longest one among my favorites, and it's the one that uses the fact that it's a television show to expand on its themes and on its story. So I fully understand what you're saying. It's uh, it's actually pretty exciting. Um,
It is. It's a deep. Our connection to television is weird, and but it can be very deep, and yeah. I think with all of the talk about like peak TV and golden age and all that stuff that people have talked about for 10 years, um, there's something about it that is remains unexplored, remains exciting, and yeah, I Utena, makes me believe things like great art is possible. So.
well, the last question was asked by Johanna. She's my sister, actually,
Hmm.
and she asks if we believe there to be a worthy successor of Utena's legacy in the current era. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, let me think. Do you?
I can
I
start if you wish. I can start with.
okay, yeah.
Okay, so, well, there are definitely creators who want to pass the torch in a similar way that Ikuhara did for the authors that inspired him. It is no secret, for example, that Rebecca Sugar is hugely influenced by Utena in her contributions to Adventure Time and Steven Universe.
Mm.
And I've heard also that the Owl House and Amphibia too, although I have not watched a single frame of them yet. I watched The Legend of Korra, and as for Japanese media, the amount of creators that the Utena influence will be too many to count.
Mm.
I have to admit, though, that I am not very convinced. At the very least, I don't think I have seen any other animation that does as much as Utena, not even among the director's own works. You can see aspects of it carried over, such as gender issues, complicated relationships, but I don't think they tackle all of them at once to build up to a point about the cultural period of time of the era that because when I watch it and I feel something gigantic about this particular time that still carries over and still relevant, uh, and
Mm.
and can speak uh, nowadays in a different way. Surprisingly, the thing that I feel the closest to Utena is a visual novel we both really enjoy, which is Butterfly Soup, which hasn't had the impact that Utena had, but carries over many similar topics. And I wouldn't be surprised if Brianna Lai, I'm not
Yeah,
sure,
yeah.
had watched the show. Maybe I'm wrong, but perhaps that's
Wait,
also.
yeah.
Sorry?
I wonder. I've never read her anything saying she had, but
Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that perhaps this is also part of why Utena still resonates and is rediscovered by people in this generation, similar to Evangelion. In a sense, I feel that Utena should have been surpassed, but for some reason hasn't. Uh,
yeah,
but but for some reason hasn't. But to end this commentary on a positive note, the fact that there are creators willing to pass the torch kind of reminds me of the conclusion of the show that this revolution manifests itself in the impact it has on the people because the people in Utena start changing their lives to healthy relationships, and it and the revolution was not just another sad memory, like Aki said.
right.
More people will keep passing the torch,
Yeah,
and maybe one day, the promise of Utena will be fulfilled.
yeah. That's nice to think. I'm not sure about actual shows being successors or a legacy of that, but on a personal level, for sure, I'm not. We're not the only people who have been impacted, and it resonates with me in ways I still can't quite see. I don't see the ends of it yet, and that's exciting. And that feeling of stepping, of being able to step out of an old world and into a new, to take a first step is, uh, yeah, it's something that I think about all the time. And so, in us and everybody who loved it, I don't know that it needs to be surpassed as much as just joined with other. revolutions, major and minor.
Okay, so I think that with this we can wrap up the podcast.
Sure, sure.
Thank you so much, Tevis, for coming up here to talk about this show for 3 hours.
Yeah.
I had a blast, and I hope you're open to express yourselves in the future about further topics.
Yes. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
I also want to thank everyone who has listened to this podcast. It means a lot because this one has been in preparation for months. So a lot of effort was put into this from my end and also from Tevis's. Uh, there will be further topics coming up, which I will announce on Twitter. So until then, see you next time.